The imperial palace was a symphony of marble and shadow, a fortress of ancient power wrapped in gilded opulence. Its vast halls stretched like catacombs of secrets, every inch of the structure holding the whispers of forgotten kings and queens. Tonight, however, there was no silence in the corridors and no peace. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension. Nightshade's footsteps echoed through the grand hall, each step deliberate, calculated. His presence filled the space with a weight not of his body but of his intentions impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss. The marble beneath his boots was cold, but to Kael, it felt warm with the promises of what lay ahead. The high-vaulted ceilings were adorned with floating crystals that pulsed in time with the distant hum of the ley lines. Above him, the stars seemed to shimmer with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. As Kael entered the hall, every noble in attendance turned their gaze upon him. The air became thicker, laden with judgment and intrigue. Some saw a man on the rise, a figure who might reshape the empire with the force of his will. Others saw the harbinger of an old world's fire, a force that would tear apart the old powers, leaving nothing but ruins. At the end of the hall, on the obsidian throne, sat Queen Seraphina Auralis, the empire's queen of steel. Her throne was a dark thing, a jagged seat of onyx that seemed as though it had been carved from the bones of some ancient beast. Draped in a gown of moon silver, her presence radiated with an ethereal, almost dangerous elegance. She sat as though she were the very embodiment of the empire itself, a stoic, unyielding, yet with a fire beneath her poised exterior that only the keenest observers could sense. Her eyes were twin storms, pools of power and intellect, and they locked onto Kael the moment he crossed the threshold. He met her gaze without a flicker of hesitation. She might have been the queen of this court, but he was the storm that would tear it down. "You've shattered the balance of power, Duke Kael." Seraphina's voice broke through the tension, soft but razor sharp. The court watches closely now. Some whisper of destiny, others of danger. Kael's lips curled into a smile that wasn't entirely friendly. "Then I've positioned myself exactly where I need to be," he said, his voice calm, controlled just enough to send ripples through the air. The nobles in the hall fell into an uneasy silence, as if they were not entirely certain how to react to this rising power that stood before their queen. No bowing, no subservient words. Kael did not deign to flatter. His words were not those of a man who sought approval but of one who already knew he was the apex. Seraphina's eyes narrowed, not with disdain, but with something akin to curiosity. She had seen many men bend before her. She had seen power struggle to kneel at her feet. But this monarch Nightshadia did not bend. His power was not one that needed her approval. And that intrigued her more than anything. She raised a gloved hand, her fingers long and graceful, and with a single gesture, she invited him to join her at the elevated banquet table. It was an unspoken challenge, an acknowledgement that Kael was no mere guest here. He was already a player in the game, whether the others liked it or not. Kael moved with the same fluid grace that had brought him here, his every step deliberate, calculated. He took his place at the table, eyes sweeping over the assembly. The nobles who had once seen him as a mere political pawn now regarded him with equal parts fear and respect. His reputation had spread like wildfire through the Empire. This was the man who had toppled Lucian, the hero who had once been considered the Empire's greatest hope. This was the man who now stood in their midst, poised to take it all. Across from him, Duke Margravia, a withered old lion whose house had once ruled the northern province, shifted in his seat. Despite his age, the Duke was still a man who knew how to wield power, and he regarded Kael with a gaze both sharp and appraising. "Duke Kael," Margrave's voice was slow, deliberate, as though he were weighing each word before speaking. "Your eyes has been astonishing. Tell you, do you seek the throne itself?" The question hung in the air, sharp as a blade. It was not a casual inquiry. Margrave had made his intentions clear, and the entire room waited for Kael's answer. Seraphina, for all her regal composure, watched with interest. She had not expected such a direct challenge in her own court. Kael did not flinch. He did not even look away. His gaze remained steady, locking with the old duke's eyes, as though the two of them were already engaged in a silent contest of wills. The room had gone silent, every ear straining to catch his reply. "A throne is not claimed through ambition alone, Duke," Kael said, his voice smooth but carrying an undeniable edge. "It is taken by those who see the board, not just the pieces, who know when to strike and when to wait." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the gathered nobles like a thick fog. Margrave's lips thinned, but Kael's gaze did not waver. "And when the time comes, those who hesitate are forgotten." A shiver ran through the room. It wasn't a threat, at least not in the traditional sense. It was something far more dangerous. It was a declaration, a prophecy. Kael wasn't just speaking of what was to come, he was shaping the future with his words. And in doing so, he made it all the more inevitable. Margrave sat back, his expression unreadable. Some of the other nobles exchanged furtive glances. A few nodded in silent agreement, as though Kael's words had struck a chord. Others seemed uneasy, unsure of how to react. Seraphina, however, had no such hesitation. A smirk tugged at her lips, and her eyes glittered with amusement. "A dangerous answer," she mused, her tone low, but unmistakably intrigued. "And a thrilling one." Kael's smile remained as he settled back in his seat. The banquet continued round them, but the words had already been spoken. Beneath the veneer of pleasantries, beneath the shared glances and the clinking of glasses, something darker had begun to shift. Alliances were being made, whispers were turning into plans, and beneath every courteous smile, a blade was being sharpened. The night wore on, each passing moment adding layers to the web of intrigue that stretched across the imperial court. But Kael, ever the patient predator, remained still. His mind was already racing, already planning the next move. Every glance, every word, every moment was a puzzle piece, each one fitting perfectly into the grand design. As the last of the nobles trickled out of the hall, their faces drawn with tension or contemplation, Kael remained seated at the long table. Seraphina signaled for the guards to leave, a silent order that no one would intrude upon the private moment between them. When the last echo of footsteps had faded, she stood and moved closer. Her presence enveloped him, and the sweet, frost-like scent of her perfume filled the air between them. She was no longer the poised queen in front of an audience. Now, she was something more, an apex predator, circling, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "You're making powerful enemies, Kael," she said, her voice a soft but dangerous murmur, like the calm before a storm. "The path you've chosen will lead you to great heights, or great ruin." Kael leaned back slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've been walking that path since the day I was born," he replied, his tone cool but carrying an undercurrent of something far more lethal. "And I'm ready for whatever comes." Seraphina's lips curled into a smile no longer political, but personal. There was a hunger in her gaze now, one that wasn't for his body, but for his mind, for his ambition, for what he could bring to Hero if he were willing to play the game as she played it. "Then let us see," she whispered, her voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate pitch. "Just how far you can go." The game had begun. And it was more than a Game of Thrones. It was a war of minds, of wills, and Kael Nightshade was no longer just a contender. He was the one who would decide how it all ended. The wind, cold and biting, swept through the towering spires of the imperial palace, caressing the marble balconies like a lover's touch, a cruel reminder of the distance between those who ruled and those who obeyed. The night sky stretched endlessly, a canvas of stars, yet the city below remained shrouded in shadows, a reflection of the tangled webs of power weaving silently beneath the surface. Kael Nightshade stood alone on the balcony, his silhouette a dark stain against the glowing city. The moonlight bathed the world in silvery luminescence, stretching the shadows of the palace into grotesque shapes, like the unseen players in the Game of Thrones. The banquet was over, but its reverberations still hummed in his mind, the subtle jabs, the veiled threats, and most importantly, the Queen's final words. "Let us see how far you can go." It was a challenge, a declaration, not a compliment. The Queen had thrown her gauntlet at his feet, and Kael had already resolved to pick it up, to stride into the heart of the Empire and play her game with a mind sharp enough to cut through the pretense of her court. Behind him, the heavy doors of his private chambers creaked open, disturbing the silence. Without turning, Kael spoke, his voice smooth and controlled. "I assume the wolves have already begun to circle." Lucia von Ragnar stepped into the moonlight, her violet eyes flashing with the cold gleam of steel. Her presence was unmistakable, a quiet storm in the flesh. "They're already licking their lips," she replied, her voice like a low growl, rich with dark amusement. "Some are afraid. Others want you removed either quietly or publicly. A few," she added, a dark smile curling at the corners of her lips, "want to marry into your name." Kael turned his head, giving her a rare smiley sharp, calculating. "Good. Let them dream. It will keep them distracted." Lucia narrowed her eyes, watching him with an intensity that could strip the flesh from bone. "And the queen?" she asked, her tone laced with suspicion. "She's what I expected," Kael said, turning back to the city below, his gaze piercing the night as though seeing beyond the horizon. "Intelligent, dangerous, but more importantly as she understands the cost of power." Lucia stepped closer, her former shadow beside him. "Do you trust her?" Kael's voice was firm, unwavering. "But I respect her. And that's far more valuable in this game." Lucia considered his words for a moment before nodding slowly, the tension in her stance easing, if only slightly. "Then tread carefully, Kael," she warned, her voice taking on a darker edge. "The Empire is a chessboard, and you're no longer just a piece." Kael's lips curled into a predatory grin. "That's because I'm the hand that moves them." The next morning, Kael's estate woke to a rhythm of purposely silent, calculated, and unyielding. Servants moved like shadows through the halls, each step measured, each action carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken orders. Guards stood at attention, their eyes sharp and alert, watching for any signs of intrusion, both physical and political. Messages arrived and departed in quick succession, letters sealed with insignia, rumors whispered behind closed doors, and strategists arrived to present their latest intelligence. The Queen had summoned him. He dressed with deliberate care, not as a noble, but as a force that would reshape the Empire. His attire, a perfect blend of black and gold, spoke of both elegance and danger, the sharp contrast highlighting the power he wielded and the authority he commanded. His family crest, barely visible beneath a high collar, was a symbol of a legacy long overshadowed by the ambitions of others. But it was not the past Kael cared about, it was the future. As he walked through the quiet palace corridors, the silence seemed to bend around him. The guards did not question him. The court attendants bowed, their eyes averted, aware that the man who passed them was no longer just a duke. He was the threat to and perhaps, the only hope this crumbling empire had left. Inside a sunlit chamber, Queen Serafina Aurelis stood by a grand window. The light caught her silver hair, weaving it into a shimmering halo, but it was her eyes, those sharp golden eyes, that held Kael's attention. There was no warmth in her gaze, no trace of the softness many believed to be inherent in a queen's nature. Instead, there was only calculation, the same sharpness that had earned her the title of the Rose of Steel. "You came quickly," she remarked, her voice low but clear, as if she had expected him to be on time, as though she already knew the man who stood before her. Kael bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that was as much a formality as it was an assertion of his own control. "When the Queen calls, only a fool arrives late." She turned to face him then, a smile curving on her lips, a smile that was both genuine and calculated. "I watched you last night. Margrave tried to corner you." You twisted his blade and handed it back, sharper. Kael met her gaze, unflinching. "That was his mistake," he said coolly. "Bringing a dagger to a war of minds." Serafina chuckled softly, the sound light yet carrying an undercurrent of dangerous amusement. "You intrigue me, Kael. Not many survive Margrave's games, let alone play them as you did." "I'd be disappointed if I didn't," Kael replied smoothly, his voice carrying a quiet confidence. The Queen's gaze lingered on him, her golden eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him, trying to peel away the layers of his carefully constructed persona. "Tell me, Kael," she asked, her voice turning slightly more serious. "What is it you truly want?" It was the question that defined kings, emperors, and even gods. What did Kael Nightshade truly want? It was a question that would reveal whether he was a tool or a player, whether he would bend the empire to his will or burn it to the ground in pursuit of his own vision. Kael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the center of the chamber, letting the silence between them stretch until it became a tangible force. He could feel the weight of her gaze on his back, The pressure of her expectations are of the expectations of everyone who had been watching him since the moment he had stepped into the game. "I want to shape what comes next," he said at last, his voice low, steady, and filled with a quiet conviction. "Not just for me or for the Empire. It's dying, choked by greed, splintered by factions, and blind to the storm that's approaching. Someone has to seize the reins before it crumbles. If I don't a broken bar, the Empire will fall, and it will be no one's fault but our own." Serafina was silent for a long moment, her golden eyes watching him with a mixture of calculation and something else, perhaps a recognition of the same ambition that burned in her own chest. "You remind me of an emperor," she said at last, her voice carrying a strange weight. "One who tried to bind the Empire to his will. He failed." Kael didn't flinch. "Then he lacked vision," he said, his voice a quiet challenge, "or resolve." Serafina turned away, her gaze drifting toward the city below, the same city that had once thrived under the reign of countless emperors. "The nobles believe they rule," she mused, her voice distant. "But they are nothing more than leeches fattened on the legacy of those who truly held power. The true power lies with those who see, who bend the future until it screams." Kael stepped closer, his boots silent on the marble floor. "Then we speak the same language." She turned to face him again, stepping so close that he could feel the heat of her presence. "Duke," she said softly, her voice dripping with the weight of finality. "I want you as my right hand, not just as a weaponer but as a partner." It was a proposition, bold and dangerous. Exactly what Kael had expected. "You want to purge the factions," he said, his voice filled with quiet understanding. "Centralize power, tear down the decaying structure and raise something new, something stronger." Serafina's smile was both ruthless and eager. "Efficient, ruthless, honest." "Yes, and I need someone capable of doing what I cannot afford to be seen doing." Kael's lips curled into a dangerous grin. "If I accept, it won't be as a servant." "You never were," she said softly, her voice almost affectionate. "That's why I chose you." There was no oath spoken between them, no ritual to bind their fates, just a single gesture, a hand extended, not in command, but in alliance. Kael took it, his grip firm, unyielding. "Then let us rewrite the Empire," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. Serafina's smile deepened, a look of genuine satisfaction on her face. Together, the web of thrones had shifted, and Kael now held the strands. The deal was sealed. Kael had secured his place beside Queen Serafina, not as a pawn, not as a mere noble ally, but as an equal in the Empire's deadliest game. But as he stepped from the towering gates of the palace, the moonlight struck his darkened form, and his thoughts turned cold and calculating. Alliances, he knew, were fragile things. They were like the strings of a bow, taut and delicate, ready to snap with the wrong tension. He moved swiftly, his long cloak fluttering behind him, the cool night hair washing over his sharp features. Serafina was formidable, indeed. Her ambition mirrored his own, her intellect a match for his own sharp mind. Yet, she was a queen, a ruler by title, and her instincts would forever be to control, to test, to push. She would challenge him, prod him, and expect submission. But Kael knew one immutable truth: no one controlled him. A small smirk tugged at his lips as he recalled the final moments of their conversation. Together, she had said. It was a promise, but more importantly, it was a declaration of their shared ambition. She would seek his loyalty or demand it, but Kael would not be so easily ensnared. His thoughts were interrupted by the sight of the carriage waiting in the shadows. Its frame was dark, sleek, like an ominous spectre against the foggy streets of the capital. Lucia von Ragnar stood beside it, her violet eyes gleaming like twin daggers in the dark. The bond between her and Kael was one of unspoken understanding. Her presence, sharp and unwavering, was a comfort, though she never let him forget that even loyalty had its limits. "You didn't refuse," Lucia remarked as Kael approached the carriage. Her voice was rich with a mix of amusement and an edge of something more. "A warning, perhaps, or a challenge?" Kael paused before sliding into the dark interior of the carriage, the leather seats creaking beneath him. "Refusing wasn't an option," he replied, settling in with a cool demeanor. "This is the best movie for now." Lucia slid in beside him with the fluidity of a shadow, her gaze fixed ahead. "The nobles will see this as a declaration of war," she said, her voice steady, though there was a trace of concern in her tone. Kael's golden eyes gleamed with dark satisfaction. "Then I'll give them a war they cannot win." The carriage rumbled to life, the horses' hooves echoing softly through the streets as they moved toward Kael's estate. The city's towers loomed overhead, their jagged silhouettes standing as silent witnesses to the shifting power of the empire. With each passing day, the delicate threads of the empire's fragile peace were unraveling, and Kael was at the center of it all. Upon arrival at the estate, Kael was greeted by his most trusted allies, those who had risen with him through the ranks of power. The room was dimly lit, the soft crackle of the fire the only sound that could be heard in the otherwise silent chamber. 3 figures waited, seated in anticipation of their leader's arrival. Lucia stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, her sharp gaze constantly alert. Dorian Ashford, the cold-hearted mercenary turned strategist, leaned back in his chair, exuding an air of nonchalance that masked the razor-sharp intellect behind his eyes. And then there was Selene Act, the ever-present whisper, whose expertise in the Empire's underworld made her invaluable to Kael's growing empire of shadows. Kael moved to the head of the table and took his seat, the flickering light from the hearth casting long shadows over his face. He steepled his fingers, his posture one of quiet command. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone knew the stakes were higher now. "You will know why we are here," Kael said, his voice steady, yet filled with the undercurrent of menace. "The Queen's favor has made me a target. Some will seek to control me. Others will seek to remove me. But they will act, and we will dictate how this game is played." Dorian smirked, leaning back in his chair with the ease of a man who had lived in the chaos of warfare for too long. "So we strike first." Kael's lips curled into a cold smile. "We give them something to chase, something that makes them believe they can win. And when they reach for it, Selene chuckled, her voice a smooth purr that cut through the tension like a blade. "We make them bleed." Kael's golden eyes gleamed with cold amusement, but there was something more underneath her sharpness, an anticipation for the coming storm. "Precisely." The room fell silent as Kael's words sank in. The power play was in motion, and there was no turning back. Those who sought to undermine him, to challenge his rise, would soon find themselves caught in a web of their own making. The very next night, a letter arrived at Duke Alistair's grand estate. It was written in precise, elegant handwriting, yet it bore no signature. The message within was simply too simple for those who were used to overanalyzing every move. It spoke of Kael's unchecked rise, of Seraphina's dangerous ambitions, and most importantly, it hinted at a fatal weakness. It was enough to stir the pot, to provoke the ambitious and paranoid noble. Duke Alistair, a man who saw opportunities in every shadow, took the bait without hesitation. His ambition had always been greater than his wisdom, and now, he believed he had found a weakness in Kael's carefully constructed armor. The wheels of conspiracy began to turn. Within days, whispers spread like wildfire through the noble courts. Kael has grown too ambitious. The Queen trusts him too much. If he is not stopped, he will become unstoppable. The nobles, those ever-present vultures, gathered in their hidden chambers and behind gilded doors. They plotted, schemed, and wove fragile webs of conspiracy. Each believed that they alone could bring Kael down. But Kael was already 3 steps ahead. A week later, Kael arrived at Duke Alistair's estate. The grand manor stood as a testament to excess. Gilded chandeliers hung from high ceilings, and embroidered banners adorned the walls like the trophies of a man who knew how to play the game of power. But Kael saw through the far section aid. Beneath the opulence, beneath the wealth, there was something more, something darker. Fear. They feared him. They resented his rise. And they would move against him. He was expected to play the role of the unwelcome guest, the outcast. But Kael played the part to perfection, walking through the halls with the ease of someone who belonged in any room. He smiled, spoke in measured tones, and allowed them to believe they were still in control. The moment came when Duke Alistair approached him, a man with a false smile, as sharp as his ambition. "Duke Kael," Alistair greeted him, his voice laced with practiced civility. "You've certainly made an impression." The Queen's new favorite. A dangerous position to hold. Kael swirled his wine glass, his golden eyes gleaming in the flickering light. "Power invites attention, doesn't it?" Alistair chuckled, his lips twitching into a thin smile. "Indeed. But power also invites danger." Kael tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the Duke. "Is that a warning?" Alistair's smile thinned, his eyes turning hard. "Perhaps a friendly piece of advice." "It would be unfortunate if such a promising career broken bar ended prematurely." Kael's smirk never wavered. "Yes, unfortunate indeed." Alistair hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough for Kael to catch it. The brief flicker of doubt, of realization, that Kael was not the man he had expected. It was an instant, but it spoke volumes. Alistair thought he was delivering a subtle threat. In reality, Kael had already laid the trap. By morning, Alistair and his allies would begin moving their pieces. Their conspiracy was already set in motion. They believed they had the perfect plan to trap Kael, to expose his weakness. They were wrong. By nightfall, Kael would ensure they never played the game again. Back at his estate, Kael stood before the roaring fire, the flames casting dancing shadows across his face. His glass of wine was half empty, the deep red liquid reflecting the firelight. Lucia entered first, her steps silent and precise. "It's done," she said simply, her expression unreadable. Celine followed, a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of her lips. "They took the bait completely. Alistair has already contacted the Margrave. They believe they have the perfect plan to trap you." Kael took a slow sip of his wine, savoring the taste of inevitable victory. "Let them believe it," he murmured. "And when the time comes, we will remind them." His voice dropped to a whisper, cold and absolute. "A broken bar why I am not to be crossed." The game was far from over. But Kael had already claimed the first victory. The Empire had always thrived on the delicate balance of power, its caught a web of intrigue and subtle betrayals. Every noble, every lord, every general, and every minister was a thread in the intricate design of the Emperor's rule. And in the center of it all, Kael had inserted himself like a shadow, an unseen force, yet one whose presence could not be ignored. His enemies had believed they had him cornered, their whispers and schemes drawing tighter around him like the noose of a hunter's trap. But they were mistaken. Every step they took toward him, every move they made in the shadows, was part of Kael's design. A trap, well laid, waiting for them to stumble into its jaws. Tonight, the game would shift. The Emperor's private council chamber was an imposing room, its cold stone walls draped in heavy banners of red and gold, bearing the Empire's sigil. A golden dragon wrapped in chains. Torches lined the walls, casting flickering shadows that danced like specters. At the far end of the chamber, a long obsidian table sat polished to a mirror's sheen, reflecting the flickering flame of the torches above. It was a table of power, and it was here that Kael would set the stage for his next move. As he entered, the room fell silent. The nobles, seated around the table, turned their attention to him. They were the Empire's most powerful lords, the men and women who shaped the fate of the realm with whispered words and subtle manipulations. Each one of them had their own agenda, their own ambitions, but for now, they were all aligned by a single common goal, to see Kael fall. At the head of the table sat Emperor Castile, a figure cloaked in control. His face was inscrutable, his eyes dark, but there was a certain amusement in the way he watched Kael enter. The Emperor was a man who reveled in the game of power, never showing his hand, always watching, always waiting for his moment to strike. Beside him, Queen Seraphina sat, her emerald eyes unreadable as ever. She had become Kael's closest ally in the Empire, but even now, he could feel the distance between them, a careful balance of trust and wariness. She had her own ambitions, and Kael was a useful tool to her. How far she would go to ensure his success, or his failure, was a question that lingered in the back of his mind. Duke Alistair, the ever-proud noble, sat near the Queen, his expression one of barely concealed hostility. The recent tension between Kael and the Duke was palpable. Alistair, along with his allies, had been positioning themselves for weeks, believing that Kael's rise was an anomaly, something to be curtailed before it grew beyond their control. Then there was the Margrave, an ancient and powerful noble whose influence stretched far beyond the capital. His cold, calculating gaze met Kael's with open disdain. The Margrave was the embodiment of the old guard, those who believed that the Empire could only be ruled through tradition and established order. He saw Kael's rise as an affront to everything he held dear, and he would not allow the young duke to usurp his power without a fight. Kael took his seat at the table with the confidence of a man who had already won. His gaze swept across the room, lingering on each of the figures present. The air was thick with tension, the weight of unspoken threats hanging over them like a storm cloud. But Kael remained calm, unshaken. He was not here to defend himself. He was here to make his move. The Emperor's voice broke the silence, smooth and dangerous, like a blade sliding across a fine silk. "Duke," he said, his tone dripping with barely concealed amusement, "it seems your rise has drawn considerable discussion." Kael leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him as he regarded the Emperor with quiet arrogance. "Power does that, Your Majesty," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "Those without it tend to fear those who wield it." The nobles around the table exchanged glances. Duke Alistair's lips curled into a thin, mocking smile. "You speak of power as if it belongs to you alone, Duke," he said, his voice laced with venom. "But power in the Empire is shared, balanced. No one man should upset that balance." Kael's lips curved slightly. "A balance that serves the weak, not the Empire," he replied, his golden eyes glinting in the torchlight. "Tell me, Duke Alistair, are you afraid that I might tip the scales?" Alistair's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Arrogance will be your downfall, boy," he sneered. "The Queen's favor will not shield you from those who truly rule." Kael's chuckle was soft, but it was tinged with ice. "No, but strength will," he said, his gaze unyielding. The Emperor watched this exchange with a quiet smile, as though enjoying the show. But Kael was not here to entertain the Emperor. He was here to claim what was rightfully his. Seraphina, who had remained silent thus far, finally spoke, her voice as smooth and dangerous as a serpent's hiss. "Enough of these petty words," she said, her emerald gaze fixed on Kael. "We are here to discuss the Empire's future, and I believe Duke Kael has something enlightening to share." Kael leaned forward slightly, clasping his hands together on the table, his posture relaxed but exuding an air of command. "Indeed," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a leader. "While my esteemed peers have been sharpening their knives in the dark, I have been securing something far more valuable than their whispers of loyalty." The room stilled, the nobles leaning in slightly, intrigued. Kael's voice remained smooth, but there was a quiet thunder behind his words. "I have spent the last month gathering the support of the Empire's border generals, the very men who defend this empire while you bicker over titles, the ones who see the Empire not as a battlefield for politics, but as a land that must be protected." Alistair's expression darkened. "You dare speak of military matters as if you command them?" He spat, his disdain evident. Kael's smile grew cold, like a wolf circling its prey. "I don't need to command them. I only needed them to see the truth that while you scheme for your own gain, the real threats to this empire go unchecked, that your balance of power is nothing more than stagnation." The Emperor's eyes glinted with interest. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharpening. "And what truth have you shown them, Duke?" Kael met his gaze unwaveringly. "That this empire is weak," he said, his voice steady. "And I will make it strong again." Silence followed, a tense and uncomfortable stillness hanging over the room. Seraphina's lips curled into a small, amused smile. The Margrave's face was ashen with barely concealed fury. Alistair's fists clenched beneath the table, and the Emperor's expression remained inscrutable, but the glimmer of approval in his eyes was unmistakable. Kael continued, his tone unwavering. "This empire does not need relics of an outdated order. It needs a vision. It needs a future. And for that, it needs leadership that does not cower behind tradition." Kael paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle in the air. Then, he made his move. "I seek to be Chancellor of the Empire." Gasps rippled through the room like a shockwave. The nobles exchanged looks of disbelief, their minds struggling to process the enormity of what Kael had just proposed. To be Chancellor was to hold the reins of the Empire itself, or a position of unmatched power, and Kael, a mere duke, was now daring to claim it. The Margrave rose to his feet, his face a mask of fury. "You overstep, Kael," he barked, his voice rising with indignation. But Kael did not look at him. He kept his gaze firmly fixed on the Emperor, his expression unchanging. He had already won. The moment he had spoken those words, the game had shifted in his favor. For a long tense moment, there was only silence. Then, the Emperor did something unexpected. He smiled. "Very well," he said, his voice calm and deliberate, the weight of his decision settling over the room. Alistair shot to his feet, his face contorted with outrage. "Your Majesty!" He began, but the Emperor raised a single hand, silencing him with the weight of his authority. "Duke Kael has proven himself capable," the Emperor said, his voice low but firm. "If he can bring stability, then let him. The Empire rewards those who show strength." Kael inclined his head, his smile a mixture of gratitude and calculated triumph. "A wise decision, Your Majesty," he said, his voice dripping with sincerity. The Emperor's eyes flickered with a hidden challenge. "Of course, power must still be tested," he said, his voice turning slightly cold. "You have until the next full moon to prove your vision. If you fail, your enemies will have every right to broken bar remove you." Kael chuckled softly, the sound like the purring of a predator. "Then I shall not fail," he replied, his tone absolute. The meeting ended, the room emptied, and Kael walked out of the chamber, his mind already whirling with the next steps. Serafina fell into step beside him, her voice low, tinged with both admiration and concern. "That was dangerous," she said, her eyes studying him intently. Kael smirked, his eyes gleaming with the promise of victory. "Power always is." Serafina smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips. "You continue to intrigue me, Kael, but let's see if you can survive what comes next." Kael didn't need to see what came next. He had already planned for it. Kael had seized control of the board, but the game was far from over. His enemies, blinded by their own ambition and arrogance, gathered their forces believing that they still held some leverage in the game. Whispers spread among the shadows, and their every move was calculated. But they were only reacting. And in their desperation, they had already played into Kael's hands. They didn't realize the war had already begun. It wasn't fought on the battlefield, nor was it fought with swords or armies. It was fought in the minds of those who thought they held power, and Kael had already won the most important battle of all. The Margrave and Duke Alistair thought their secret meeting was secure. A grand estate outside the capital, fortified with loyal soldiers and veiled in secrecy, was to be the birthplace of their counter-strategy. Surrounded by men who swore fealty, they believed they had drawn up their plans in absolute privacy. But loyalty, like power, was always in flux. Hours before their gathering, a single, well-placed rumor had been set loose like an arrow flying through the dark of night. "There is a traitor among them. A man who smiles in their presence but kneels to cleanse secret. No proof, no name, just a whisper in the right ears." And so, as the nobles sat in a grand, candlelit hall, discussing their plans, doubt began to coil around their throats like a silent noose. They began to question each other, their eyes darting suspiciously over the faces of those they once considered allies. The Margrave's fingers drummed steadily against the table, his gaze flickering from one potential ally to the next. His thoughts, once sharp and clear, were now muddied with suspicion. Duke Alistair's hand, once steady and confident, hovered near the hilt of his dagger, as though a false word would trigger an immediate strike. Our lord hesitated before speaking, his voice faltering as if his own words would betray him. Each whisper, each glance, carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken accusations. But Kael was not in the room. He did not need to be. He had already set in motion the forces that would tear them apart. Power did not rest solely in the gilded halls of the nobility. It lived in the streets, in the hands of the merchants who supplied armies, the soldiers who enforced the commands of the nobles, and the common people who would, in the end, decide the empire's fate. And Kael had claimed them all. It had begun innocently enough. Over the course of just a few days, trade routes shifted, moving from the hands of the Margrave's trusted merchants to those who owed Kael their loyalty. Gold changed hands, silently, with the subtlety of a snake's bite. Mercenaries who once served the Margrave suddenly found themselves with more lucrative offers, ones they could not refuse. Every whispered offer and under-the-table deal Kael had arranged began to pay off in ways his enemies had not anticipated. When the Margrave's forces required supplies to continue their struggle, they found their shipments delayed or sometimes entirely missing, leaving their soldiers stranded and demoralized. Meanwhile, Kael's own supply lines surged with efficiency, and his forces grew stronger. When Duke Alistair sought to turn the city's people against Kael, he found himself met with confusion, then defiance. The streets, once filled with the whispers of rebellion, were now filled with the hum of Kael's influence. His name, once spoken with disdain, was now praised for the order he had brought. A simple fact: Kael had already given the people what they truly wanted: stability. Not promises, not vague speeches about the future. He had delivered results. He had delivered order. 3 nights before the Emperor's deadline, the nobles gathered in the Grand Council chamber. They came prepared for war, armed with accusations, with plans to turn the Emperor against Kael. Instead, they would find that the war they thought they were fighting was already over. The chamber was vast, its obsidian walls carved with ancient symbols that spoke of rulers long forgotten. The air was thick with the weight of generations of power. The Emperor sat upon his throne, the embodiment of calm authority, his presence overwhelming, and beside him stood his enforcer, a man known not for speeches or pleas, but for passing sentence swiftly and without hesitation. The enforcer stepped forward, unrolling a scroll. His voice, cold and final, filled the room. By decree of His Imperial Majesty, Duke Alistair is hereby stripped of his titles and lands for crimes against the Empire. The hall erupted in shock. Gasps filled the room, and the faces of the gathered nobles twisted in disbelief. Alistair shot up, his face contorted with rage. His voice cracked with desperation. "This is madness. Lies. I demand proof." "You cannot." A second scroll was unfurled by the enforcer. "Confessions from your own allies. Written statements. Testimonies." Alistair's gaze shifted to the faces around him, and the horror began to sink in. His Alyssa, his trusted companions in the shadows, had betrayed him. To save themselves from the growing tide of Kael's influence, they had fed him to the wolves. The Margrave rose as well, fury filling his voice. "This is a trap. The Empire cannot." A third scroll was unrolled by the enforcer, its contents as damning as the first 2. "Margrave Rendell is also stripped of his command, pending trial for conspiracy and treason." Silence. The Emperor's voice, even and detached, broke the stillness. "You played the game and lost." Alistair, desperate now, turned to face Kael. His eyes were wild with fury and panic. "We're broken bar. You planned this from the start, didn't you? You set us up like pawns in your little game." Kael stood, unshaken, his eyes calm and cold. His smile was the faintest curve, a blade hidden beneath silk. Of course. His words, soft as they were, carried the weight of 1,000 victories. In that moment, the truth settled upon the room like a dark fog. Kael had orchestrated everything: the rumors, the betrayals, the shifting alliances. Everything had been part of his design, and his enemies had never seen it coming. As the guards entered, they took the 2 men in chains, their once proud titles reduced to ash. Alistair fought, his voice rising in futile defiance. He screamed, cursed Kael's name, and vowed vengeance, but it was meaningless. The game was over. They had lost, and Kael had won. As Kael left the chamber, his movements deliberate and calm, Seraphina fell into step beside him. Her emerald eyes, once filled with uncertainty, now sparkled with something new, something Kael had yet to fully understand. "That was dangerous," she remarked, her voice low but edged with amusement. Kael's smirk never wavered. "Power always is." She tilted her head, as though seeing him in a different light, a flicker of new respect glimmering in her gaze. "You continue to intrigue me, Kael, but let's see if you can survive what comes next." Kael chuckled softly, the sound of quiet assurance. "I already have." And as the halls of the Empire shifted beneath his feet, the echoes of his victory reverberated through the hearts of all who dwelled within it. The game had just begun. The Empire's future was his to shape, and no one, not even the Emperor himself, could stop him now. For Kael, the war had already been won. Kael stood on the balcony of his new estate, the evening sun casting a golden hue over the sprawling imperial capital. The city sprawled beneath him, its labyrinth of streets and towers bathed in the warmth of dusk. From this vantage point, the grandeur of the capital was undeniable. Yet, the scent of victory was mixed with the ever-present awareness that in the game of power, no one near, especially not Hema, could afford to linger in the afterglow for too long. Victory was not an end, it was merely a step, a piece in the grander play. Seraphina's voice interrupted his thoughts. It said sharp with a familiar mixture of curiosity and calculation. Even with your enemies crushed, the empire still isn't yours. Kael turned, his expression an unreadable mask. Seraphina stood near the large wooden doors of the estate's great hall, her crimson gown flowing elegantly around her, the rich fabric catching the low light. A glass of red wine rested delicately between her fingers, the liquid swirling as she gave him a calculating look. He smirked slightly. Because the emperor still sits on his throne? Her eyes narrowed slightly, a glimmer of something, perhaps challenge, perhaps intrigue dancing in the emerald depths of her gaze. And what do you intend to do about that? Kael stepped away from the balcony, the soft rustle of his cloak the only sound in the otherwise still evening. He approached Seraphina, his movements confident, deliberate. There are 3 ways to remove a ruler, Seraphina, he began, his voice smooth, each word measured. Assassination, revolution, or irrelevance. Her lips curved into a knowing smile, and she leaned slightly closer, almost as if daring him to elaborate. And which will you choose? Kael's gaze darkened, his lips curling into a subtle smile. None. Seraphina raised an eyebrow, and he could see the flicker of surprise in her eyes. She didn't expect that answer. He stepped closer, his presence imposing, yet measured. The emperor will destroy himself. I will merely a broken bar guide the process. The game, as Kael knew all too well, was not about brute force. It was about manipulation, control, and subtlety. The emperor, for all his might and arrogance, had weaknesses, and those weaknesses were his downfall. Kael had spent months, if not years, uncovering every crack, every flaw in the emperor's rule. And now, those cracks were widening, grumbling under the pressure of Kael's unseen hand. While the court had focused on the rebellion led by Duke Alistair and the Margrave, Kael had quietly infiltrated the emperor's inner circle, exploiting the dissension and fractures that already existed. There was no need to create chaos. It was already there, bubbling beneath the surface, waiting for someone with the foresight and patience to manipulate it. The whispers of the emperor's paranoia had reached Kael's ears long ago. General after general had begun questioning the emperor's decisions, ministers grumbled about his incompetence, and loyalists quietly withdrew their support. It wasn't enough to simply wait for the inevitable collapse. No, Kael had to expedite the process, fan the flames of doubt and distrust. He'd begun subtly shifting the balance of power within the military, feeding the generals a steady diet of uncertainty. First, there were the supplely chained disruptions, a small, seemingly insignificant events that would have gone unnoticed had Kael not intervened. He arranged for merchant caravans to be mysteriously delayed, for essential materials to disappear. The emperor's ministers scrambled to resolve these issues, only to find themselves overwhelmed by an invisible hand. When Kael offered his solutions, they came as if from nowhere, unfathomably swift and efficient. Soon, the military leadership depended on Kael's ingenuity to keep their forces supplied, to keep the empire's armies strong. Next, funds allocated for the army disappeared in bureaucratic red tape, siphoned off by corrupt officials whose loyalties Kael had long since bought. When the generals turned to the emperor for resolution, their pleas fell on deaf ears, drowned out by the emperor's incessant demands for more control, more obedience. Again, Kael intervened, orchestrating the release of funds with an ease that suggested he was the true power in the empire, not the fractured emperor. Finally, Kael had engineered a series of small-scale conflicts that required immediate military attention: banded trades on key trade routes, skirmishes with rogue mercenaries, small but critical military failures that made the emperor look weak and indecisive. The generals, desperate for Kael's assistance, had no choice but to rely on him. By the time the emperor took notice, Kael's influence over the military was all but complete. But that was only part of the plan. The final blow would come from the people. The emperor had long relied on fear and loyalty to maintain his rule, but Kael understood something the emperor never had: fear was fragile. It could be broken. And once broken, it was nearly impossible to restore. Kael carefully cultivated a sense of unrest, a simmering discontent that had long been suppressed. When the right moment came, he would strike. And strike he did. The rebellion, which had begun as a few whispered plots in dark corners of taverns, was transformed into a grand spectacle. Kael had carefully orchestrated every detail, ensuring that it would appear as a true rebellion. Dissidents were stoked, soldiers defected, and key nobles hesitated, their loyalty no longer guaranteed. The emperor, sitting safely within the walls of his palace, was no longer seen as the savior of the empire. The people no longer turned to him for guidance. They turned to Kael. With one final push, Kael exposed the emperor's inability to maintain control. The military, once a symbol of the emperor's unchallenged authority, now faltered. The streets, once filled with the emperor's loyalists, were filled with murmurs of Kael's name. The illusion shattered. The emperor was no longer the pillar of strength and stability. He was a man on a crumbling throne. Kael had not taken the throne by force. He had not assassinated the emperor or led a revolution. He had simply let the man's own weaknesses consume him. And when the time came for the final confrontation, it was clear that the emperor knew he had lost. The grand chamber was silent, the weight of inevitability hanging heavy in the air. The once mighty emperor, whose iron rule had once seemed unshakable, sat slumped upon his throne, his face pale, the years of rulership now etched into the lines of his face. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, were now dull, exhausted. He stared at Kael, the man who had outmaneuvered him at every turn, with a mixture of dread and recognition. Were broken bar. The emperor's voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. You planned all of this. Kael, standing before him, offered no reply at first, simply gazing down at the broken man who had once held so much power. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he spoke. Planned? Number. I merely allowed nature to take its course. The emperor's fingers trembled as they gripped the armrests of his throne. His voice cracked with bitterness. You could have killed me, taken the throne by force. Kael took a slow step forward, his presence overwhelming. That would have been crude, inelegant. No, Your Majesty. Broken bar. He leaned in, his voice a soft whisper. I do not need to sit upon the throne. The emperor's lips parted in disbelief, but no words came. I already rule the empire. The emperor's eyes widened as the weight of Kael's words sank in. The illusion of his invulnerability, his dominion, shattered. He was no longer the ruler. He was a man who had been undone by his own frailty, his own pride. Kael turned, ready to leave the chamber. Serafina walked beside him, silent for a long moment. As they neared the door, she let out a quiet, amused chuckle. You are dangerous, Kael, she said, her voice dripping with both admiration and something darker. Kael smirked. Only to those who oppose me. Serafina raised an eyebrow, her gaze assessing. You claim you don't need the throne. But what happens when the world demands a crowned ruler? Kael chuckled, his eyes gleaming. Then I will let them wear the crown. A broken bar while I rule from the shadows. She smiled, raising her glass in a quiet toast to the true ruler of the empire. Then Kael smirked and took the glass from her hand, their fingers brushing. Indeed, as the door closed behind them, the empire lay in Kael's hands. The throne was irrelevant. The true power was his to wield. And this was only the beginning. Kael moved through the imperial corridors with a certain purpose, his footsteps resonating in the once grand halls that now seemed hollow. The imperial palace had once thrummed with life, with ambition, with power. Now, it felt like a mausoleum, a silent witness to the fall of an era, its once proud emperor now nothing more than a ghost within his own walls. The emperor had not officially abdicated. He was still on the throne, though Kael knew the truth. He had already been dethroned. A ruler doesn't need to be toppled by a sword or dagger when his own people no longer obey him. The emperor might as well have been a puppet, his strings pulled by Kael's unseen hand. The empire no longer moved by his will. It moved at Kael's, even if that truth was not yet openly acknowledged. Serafina stood at the grand archway leading to the balcony, her figure bathed in the soft candlelight that flickered like a warning. She turned as Kael approached, her emerald eyes sharp, studying him with a mixture of curiosity and something deeper, more dangerous. Her crimson gown caught the dim light, rippling like liquid fire as she took a slow, deliberate sip from her glass of wine. So, how does it feel? She asked, her voice both teasing and expectant. Kael did not immediately answer. His gaze lingered on the horizon, where the first stars began to dot the sky, their soft glow hinting at the endless possibilities before him. It was a scene of Victoria, of an empire he had yet to claim but already held in his grasp. Like placing the final stone in the foundation, Kael replied, his voice smooth and calm. betraying no emotion. Serafina raised a brow, not entirely satisfied. Not like toppling a tyrant. Kael's lips curved into a smile, but it was more a gesture of amusement than anything else. The Emperor was never the true problem. He was a figurehead, a puppet for the failing system that held the Empire together with brittle strings. I did not need to replace him, I only needed to ensure the system no longer required him. Serafina's lips parted in quiet admiration. She stepped closer, her gaze studying him with increasing intensity. A man who rules without a crown, a broken bar, that is a dangerous thing. Kael turned toward her, his presence filling the space between them. The room seemed to shrink under his dominance, and even the air itself seemed to hold its breath. He met her gaze with a quiet intensity, his voice low but sure. A throne binds a man. Power unchained is far more dangerous. She leaned in slightly, intrigued yet cautious. And what will you do with such unchained power? Kael's smile was slow, predatory. It was the smile of a hunter who had just cornered his prey, knowing there was no escape. Shape the world into what it must become. Serafina regarded him for a long moment before stepping back, taking another sip from her glass, the crimson liquid swirling in the dim light. Indeed, she said quietly, almost as if mulling the idea over. And what of the Empire? Will you let it crumble, or will you breathe life back into its rotting bones? Kael met her gaze once more, his eyes flashing with the promise of things to come. The Empire is no longer the centerpiece of my ambitions. It is but a stepping stone, a stage upon which the real game will be played. We will see what I can do with it, but I will not be confined by it. The council meeting was held the following evening. The great hall, usually filled with the clamor of debate and the weight of political machinations, was now shrouded in a thick, uncomfortable silence. The high-born nobles, generals, and economic leaders stood like statues, their faces pale and eyes averted. The Emperor's chair, once the symbol of absolute power, sat in the center of the room, but it might as well have been empty. The throne was a mere prop in a play that had already been written. Kael stood at the head of the room, his presence commanding attention without a word. The nobility was restless, their eyes flicking nervously between one another, unsure of what would come next. For all their power and wealth, they were now helpless in the face of Kael's overwhelming control. He let the silence stretch, watching them squirm. It was a game, and Kael played it well. When the tension reached its peak, he spoke, his voice calm and measured. The Empire stands at a crossroads. It can remain a stagnant husk of its former self, weighed down by old rivalries, bureaucratic incompetence, and fragile egos, a broken bar, or it can evolve. He paused, allowing his words to sink in, watching as fear and uncertainty flickered in the eyes of those before him. Change is inevitable, he continued, his tone sharpening. Either we guide it, or we are crushed beneath it. A murmur ran through the room, a mixture of unease and hesitant agreement. The Minister of War, a seasoned veteran with sharp eyes and a hard jaw, cleared his throat. And who will guide this change? Kael's gaze never wavered as he leaned forward, his voice cold and final. We will. He did not need to declare himself emperor. He had already won. His every word carried weight. His every move dictated the empire's future. The generals, the nobility, the ministers, so they were already his. He had never needed the throne. Power was not about sitting on a gilded chair, it was about making others dance to your tune, making them believe they had no other choice but to follow. The room remained tense as the realization sank in. Kael was not some conqueror coming to seize the crown by force. He was already the master of the empire. He had already claimed its soul. What was left now was only the final formalization of what had already been decided. Yet even as Kael solidified his grip over the empire's political structures, he understood that power was never truly secure until it was unchallenged. And there were whispers or rumors of a shadowy faction that had shaped the fate of the empire from behind the scenes for centuries. They were known only as the Eclipsed Order. Serafina had been instrumental in securing Kael's control over the wavering nobles and generals, using subtle threats and promises that bound them to him. But Kael knew that this would not be enough to hold the empire together. He needed more. He needed the secretive forces that had always lurked in the shadows, guiding rulers from afar. Kael's search for them led him to an ancient vault beneath the imperial palace, a place long forgotten by most. The air was thick with dust and age, the walls lined with the forgotten texts of long-dead scholars. As he carefully opened the tome before him, the ink faded with age, but the knowledge contained within was invaluable. The Eclipsed Order had been there throughout the rise and fall of every emperor, and their influence was embedded deep within the empire's foundation. The secrets were there, in black and white. A hidden order that had shaped the empire for centuries, ensuring stability by pulling the strings from the shadows. And now, Kael would introduce himself to them. He would not be their pawn. He would be the one to write history. Days later, a letter arrived, an invitation, without a name or seal, just a simple message. The Eclipsed Order wished to meet him. Kael, ever the master of control, did not hesitate. That evening, under the cover of night, Kael donned black attire, his movements fluid and calculated. He arrived at their location, an abandoned chapel at the edge of the city. The doors creaked open as he stepped inside, the scent of aged parchment and burning candles filling the air. The space was cold, the shadows heavy, yet Kael felt no unease. He was the one who controlled the darkness now. A figure stood at the altar, cloaked in shadow. Their voice, when it came, was smooth, measured, and utterly confident. "You have done well." Kael raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "You've been watching me, then?" "We watch all who seek the throne," the figure said, voice echoing slightly in the empty chapel. "It is our duty to ensure the empire remains a broken bar stable." "And if I refuse your guidance?" Kael asked, his tone challenging. The figure's voice remained calm, unwavering. "Then history shall repeat itself." Kael chuckled darkly, a low, dangerous sound. He took a step forward, his confidence radiating like a wave. The shadows shifted around him, bending to his will. "I think not." He stepped closer to the figure, his presence suffocating the space. "I do not fear history. I write it." The figure said nothing, but the tension in the air shifted. The game had only just begun. The air in the chapel was thick, alive with an unseen pulse, as Kael stood motionless at the altar. Every shadow, every flicker of candlelight, seemed to have a life of its own, curling and twisting like a predator's breath. The darkness hung heavy, an oppressive force that clawed at the edges of his consciousness. The figure in the hood did not stir. They stood motionless, an enigmatic presence that radiated power, commanding attention without uttering a single word. Kael understood at once, he was being tested. This was not the realm of the visible world, where power was won with swords and words, alliances and betrayals. This was the realm of shadows, where power was wielded in silence, where the unseen dictated the fates of kings. The Eclipsed Order had no use for men who ruled by the light of Dia. They ruled from the dark, from the corners of the empire, from beneath the bones of history itself. Kael's lips curled into a small, dangerous smile, one that did not show the slightest trace of unease. He had been born into darkness, raised in the shadows of the world. He had learned long ago that the darkness could either suffocate you, or it could be made to bow before you. "So this is how you measure worth?" Kael's voice broke the stillness, cutting through the thick air. The figure did not move, but a voice emerged, layered and spectral, as though it reverberated from the very walls of the chapel, the remnants of long-forgotten ceremonies. "We measure worth not in words, a broken bar, but in survival." Kael's smile widened as the air around him seemed to tighten, as if the very fabric of the world was drawing closer, watching him. He knew what was coming. Without warning, the shadows lunged. They came like vipers, faster than the eye could follow, darker than the night itself, striking with a deadly precision. The first blow came from the left, too quick to see, but Kael was already moving. His coat flared as he twisted, ducking beneath the strike, the sharp hiss of air the only warning. Another came from the right, low and swift. Kael dodged again, narrowly avoiding the deadly tendril that would have pierced his side. And in a complete darkness, the flames of the candles flickered and died. The room, once bathed in light, became an abyss. The silence grew thick, the only sound Kael's own breathing, steady and controlled. His senses heightened. This was not a fight of strength. It was a fight of perception. He had faced countless enemies, both seen and unseen. But this was something different. He could feel the shadows circling him, closing in with intent. There was no sound, no warning before the first blow. The strike came, a cold, phantom fist slammed into his ribs, sharp and punishing. He staggered but caught himself, his senses already calculating the next attack. Another blow landed on his shoulder, a phantom strike that was gone before he could even respond. Kael's heart beat steadily, his mind focused. Every breath he took, every movement he made, was deliberate. He wasn't fighting, he was listening, observing. The shadows were not random. They followed patterns or subtle shifts in the air, a whisper of pressure before they struck. He could feel the movement of the dark tendrils, could sense their presence before they made contact. Kael's mind moved faster than his body, calculating the trajectory of every strike before it landed. He shifted again, moving to the left just as another shadow darted toward him. His fingers closed around it, cold and slick as though it were a living thing, a serpent made of night itself. The thing hissed in his grasp, its form writhing and trying to pull free. He smiled coldly. "You hide behind illusions," he muttered, his voice a low growl. "But I am the man who strips illusions bare." With a sudden, forceful motion, he wrenched the shadow apart. It screeched in agony, the sound echoing through the empty chapel like a dying beast. The tendril dissolved into smoke, evaporating into nothingness. Kael exhaled, his breath steady. "You believe shadows can govern me?" he continued, his voice calm, almost bored. "You are mistaken." Another shadow lunged at him, but this time, Kael was ready. He ducked, rolling to the side as the dark tendril passed harmlessly through the air where he had just stood. With a swift motion, he reached out, his hand closing around the next shadow. This one struggled more fiercely, its form thrashing like a living beast desperate for freedom. Kael tightened his grip, squeezing until the tendril cracked and dissolved. The dark was growing restless. The shadows surged around him, faster now, desperate to overwhelm him. Kael's movements became a blur as he danced with them, each strike a measured counter to the unseen forces that assaulted him. His coat swirled around him like a shroud, his body fluid and precise, every movement calculated with deadly intent. And then, with a final, decisive motion, he caught the last shadow in his grasp. This one was different. It was stronger, more determined, but Kael's grip did not falter. He held it firmly, feeling it fight against him like a beast in its death throes. He pulled, twisted, and with a final snap, the shadow shattered like glass, vanishing into the air. Light returned. The candles flickered, their flames once again casting long shadows across the stone walls. Kael stood there, breathing steadily, his coat falling back into place as he faced the figure at the altar. The figure did not speak immediately. Instead, they stood there, their cloak flowing like liquid darkness, their face hidden beneath the hood. Slowly, they inclined their head, acknowledging Kael's victory. "You are unexpected," the figure said, their voice distant and measured. Kael smirked, brushing dust from his coat. "You'll get used to it." The figure raised a hand, and the stone altar before them shifted, moving with unnatural ease. It split down the middle, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the depths of the earth. The air grew colder, the oppressive weight of the shadows deeper. Kael glanced briefly at Seraphina, who stood silent and composed beside him, her eyes betraying nothing. She knew what this meant, just as he did. They were stepping into a world of secrets that could break empires and destroy kings. With a final glance at the chapel's darkened interior, Kael descended into the shadows. Secrets beneath the empire. The passage below the chapel was colder than the grave, the air thick with ancient dust and the scent of forgotten secrets. The walls of the corridor were etched with glyphs and symbols, their meanings lost to time. They seemed to watch him as he passed, an ancient, unblinking gaze. Seraphina walked beside him, her eyes tracing the markings on the walls. "These aren't just relics," she murmured. "They're warnings. This place here broken bar. It's not just a vault of knowledge. It's a tomb, a prison." Kael said nothing in response. He did not fear tombs. He had buried enough of his own history to know that the dead could never hold him. The stairs seemed to stretch forever, each step echoing in the silence like the ticking of clock counting down to something inevitable. The deeper they went, the heavier the air grew. It was as though the very foundation of the empire itself was pressing down on them. Finally, they reached the bottom. Before them was a vast, circular chamber, its walls adorned with ancient symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. In the center of the room stood a monolith, black as the void, pulsing with an eerie light. It was as though the stone itself was alive, its surface vibrating with a heartbeat not its own. Around the monolith stood figures, masked and silent, each one cloaked in darkness. They were seated in a perfect circle, their presence cold and implacable. The figure who had led Clan Serafina down the stairs stepped forward, their movements graceful but deliberate. They raised their arms, and the circle of figures stood in unison. The central figure spoke, their voice echoing through the chamber. Duke of no nation, you stand before the keepers of the Empire's soul. We have guided emperors, shaped kingdoms, buried kings. Tell us. Their voice was deep, heavy with ancient authority. Why should we let you live? Kael stepped forward, his eyes cold and unwavering, meeting the gaze of the figure at the center of the circle. He was no longer the boy who had started this journey. He was a force in his own right, a storm that could not be tamed. Because I am not a king, he said, his voice steady and strong. I am something far more dangerous. The figure paused, their head tilting ever so slightly. Kings inherit thrones. They kneel to symbols, obey laws etched in crumbling stone. I have done none of that, and yet I rule. He stepped closer to the monolith, letting its pulse wash over him, feeling its cold power seep into his very being. You fear me, Kael continued, his words deliberate. Because I do not ask permission to exist. For a long moment, the chamber was silent. The shadows seemed to grow heavier, the air thick with tension. Then, the figure at the center of the circle raised their head, their masked face unreadable. Then let us see, they intoned, their voice echoing in the chamber. How high you rise, ye broken bow before the fall claims you. Kael's smirk returned, colder, sharper than before. Let the real game begin. Kael stood like a statue at the center of the chamber, the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes pressing upon him from the shadows. The air was thick with the palpable tension of the eclipsed order, their presence both ethereal and suffocating. Their faces, concealed behind masks of black and silver, seemed to shimmer and shift with the flickering light of the central monolith. It pulsated, an obsidian tower at the heart of this ancient sanctum, its surface alive with an otherworldly energy that made Kael's skin prickle with the promise of long-forgotten power. The eclipsed order had called him here, the order that had bent the very fabric of the empire to its will for centuries, whose whispers had toppled monarchs, buried kingdoms, and extinguished those who dared challenge the status quo. And now, here he was standing among them, his future hanging by the thinnest of threads. The first test had been passed, but the true challenge had only begun. The central figure, tall, shrouded in robes of woven shadows, finally broke the silence, their voice rich and full, a sound that felt both foreign and intimate, as if it came from the very marrow of history itself. You speak well, Kael, Duke of no nation. The voice intoned, its echoes lingering long after the words had faded. But words, no matter how sharp, are but hollow blades if they do not carve their mark into history. Kael allowed a small, confident smirk to curve his lips. His reply was deliberate, measured, as always. If that were true, you would not be here, he said, his voice soft, velvet and steel woven together. This chamber exists because of words. The whispers of your order have toppled kingdoms, silenced rulers, and dictated the course of empires. You know better than any. The deadliest weapons are not forged in steel, but in secrets. The response was immediate. A ripple ran through the masked council, some figures shifting slightly in their seats, others remaining completely still, as if they were nothing but part of the stone itself. There was something in the air now, a subtle change, a shift of power, of recognition. Kael could feel it. The tension was thick, but beneath it, there was something else, curiosity, interest, discomfort, amusement. The scent of the game shifting. The central figure gave a slow, deliberate nod. Then let us see how you wield such weapons. With a slight, almost imperceptible movement of their hand, the monolith began to shift. Its black surface rippled like liquid, folding in upon itself, revealing a swirling mist that rose up and expanded into the air, coalescing into a map. It was an ethereal projection of the Empire, vast and sprawling. Cities, castles, noble houses, and hidden factions were all displayed before him, flickering like distant ghosts. The map moved and shifted with a life of its own, a reflection of the unseen power that governed the empire. Kael's gaze sharpened. He studied the map with a keen eye, taking in the shifting, spectral images. At the center of it a leather heart of the Emperor sat the golden throne, its brilliance dimming with every passing moment. A flickering light, a weakening grip. The Emperor, once untouchable, now seemed small. His rule was failing, his power fraying at the edges. Around him, Kael could almost feel the encroaching threat, enemies circling like wolves around a dying stag. The danger was real. Civil war was not just a possibility, it was inevitable. A figure from the council, their voice as smooth as silk, broke the silence. "The Emperor weakens," the figure murmured, their tone a soft, dangerous whisper. "His enemies scent blood." "Civil war is not a possibility, it is an inevitability." Another voice, ear deep, thick as stone, followed. "The noble houses sharpen their knives." The Church of the Radiant Sun whispers of divine succession. The Eastern warlords rally under a single banner. The merchant guilds offer fortunes for control of the imperial coffers. The mist swirled, reacting to the movement of the voices. It was alive with potential, with possibilities. And in the center of this shifting vortex, Kael's own image emerged, a flickering, unstable, caught between the uncertainties of the future. "You stand at the crossroads of history, Kael," the silk-voiced counselor murmured. "What will you do?" Kael stood motionless for a long moment, his eyes never leaving the shifting map. His mind, however, was already calculating, already seeing the intricacies of the game. Every faction had a play, every faction had a weakness. But he was no mere pawn in this game. He was the one moving the pieces. With deliberate precision, Kael raised his hand. His fingers brushed through the mist. The spectral images trembled at his touch, quivering as if they could feel the power he exuded. His fingers hovered over a symbol, a house Varian, a noble house, influential, with deep ties to the imperial court. He twisted his wrist, shifting the image, subtly, with a single motion. The balance of power shifted with it. The figures around him leaned in. They had seen what he had done. The air was thick with their attention. It was a silent acknowledgement, a recognition of the weight of his actions. "I do not serve thrones," Kael's voice rang out, smooth and unfaltering. "Nor do I kneel to gods or kings." He let the words hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final blow, his voice cutting through the chamber like a knife through silk. "But I will ensure that when this war comes, I decide who wins." For a long, tense moment, the council remained silent, the air between them crackling with the weight of his declaration. Kael could feel the shadows around him stirring, the power of the eclipsed order reacting to his words. But none spoke. Then, with a soft, almost imperceptible chuckle, the central figure broke the silence. "Interesting," they murmured, their voice filled with a quiet amusement. "You claim not to play the game, yet you move the pieces as if you own the board." Kael's smirk deepened, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "That's because I do." The council exchanged whispers, low, rustling voices like wind through a graveyard. The moment stretched on, filled with an eerie sense of anticipation. It was clear that the eclipsed order was intrigued, or perhaps even impressed. But Kael knew better than to rest on his laurels. This was only the beginning. The true game was yet to unfold. Then, with a fluid motion, the silk-voiced counselor stepped forward. She moved with an almost predatory grace, her presence commanding the room, as if she had controlled men from behind veils and candle-lit chambers for centuries. Her mask, an intricate piece of silver filigree, depicted a weeping rose, its petals seemingly caught in an eternal lament. "Then let us make a bargain, Kael," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 years of secrets. Kael raised an eyebrow, his gaze never leaving hers. He said nothing, waiting. "The eclipsed order does not serve. We do not obey," the counselor continued, her voice nearly playful yet filled with a subtle warning. "If you wish to walk in our shadows, you must do more than speak boldly." With a casual flick of the wrist, the mist shifted once more, coiling in on itself. The figure of a woman began to form within the mist, her features faint, her image half hidden by shadow. She was young, noble, important, her golden hair tangled in chains, her emerald eyes burning with defiance. She looked like someone caught in a web of fate, trapped yet defiant. "Lady Evelyn Ardent," the counselor's voice was silken poison. "The Emperor's niece." The Eastern warlords hold her as a pawn, a bargaining chip for their rebellion. Kael's eyes narrowed slightly, his mind immediately calculating the implications. Evelyn's capture was no accident. She was an heir to the throne, valuable, dangerous. If she were rescued or worse, controlled, it could shift the entire balance or power. The Empire's succession would hang on her fate, and with it, the fate of the Empire itself. The counselor's voice dropped to a whisper, wrapping around Kael's mind like a chain. "Rescue her," she murmured. "Decide her fate." And in doing so broke and barred decide the fate of the Empire. The chamber was utterly still. Kael's breath slowed as he took in the weight of the situation. A delicate piece had been placed in his hands. Would it become a sword to carve his way to power? Or would it become a chain, binding him to the eclipsed order's will? A slow smirk spread across Kael's lips as he exhaled softly. "Very well," he said, his voice cold as steel. The game had truly begun. The journey eastward took them through a desolate landscape, where the earth had long since surrendered to war and neglect. The plains were as barren as the hope that had once fueled them. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a constant reminder of the endless strife that had plagued the land. As they rode, the cliffs of the Warlord Confederacy rose like jagged teeth against a bruised sky, cutting through the horizon. In the distance, Blackthorn Keep stood a silent, ancient, unyielding. It was a fortress that had witnessed countless battles, each one carving new scars into its already battered stone. Kael's entourage was smaller, deliberately so. Every companion was chosen with surgical precision. No unnecessary warriors, no excess baggage. These were not just soldiers, they were instruments, each selected for a particular task in Kael's grand design. Behind him, Veyron, ever the composed and silent confidant, led their small but lethal group with an air of practiced indifference. As they approached the keep, the first signs of the Warlord Confederacy became visibly, smoke rising in thick coils from the valley below, signaling the lawless brutality that awaited them. The faint sounds of war drums could be heard in the distance, the constant thrum of tribal rhythms that spoke of a kingdom built on might and savagery. Kael's eyes narrowed as the imposing shape of Blackthorn Keep finally came into full view. Its stone walls were scarred by age and conflict, and the black iron spikes that adorned the ramparts looked more like the weapons of the dead than defenses against living foes. This place was not just a fort, it was a symbol of survival. It had endured centuries of siege, betrayal, and bloodshed, and it would take more than just a few words to bring it to its knees. Kael stood upon a frost-swept ridge, his breath rising in tendrils of mist. The wind howled, but his stance was unwavering. It was as if the very elements recognized the weight of his presence. Veyron, riding beside him, broke the silence that had settled over the group. His voice was low, but it carried a hint of knowing sarcasm. "They expect words," Veyron remarked dryly, eyes focused on the distant keep. Kael did not respond immediately, his gaze locked on the fortress before him. The icy winds of the east seemed to bite deeper now, as if the land itself was warning him of the challenge ahead. Slowly, he turned to his companion and smirked, a sharp, predatory grin that suggested he was far from worried. "Then we'll feed them lies," Kael replied, his tone cold and measured, "until steel finishes the conversation." As they approached the gates of Blackthorn Keep, the mood shifted from silent anticipation to the heavy, oppressive weight of war. The Warlord's hall stank of meat, sweat, and arrogancy, a place that reeked of entitlement and survival. Men who had long abandoned any semblance of civility now thrived here, their animalistic instincts honed by years of constant battle. Flickering torchlight illuminated their battered faces, grim and unsmiling, as they hunched over long wooden tables, glaring at Kael with barely concealed hostility. They were the last of a dying breed, men forged by bloodshed, who saw no future beyond the next fight. Kael walked through the hall as if he owned the place. His steps were deliberate, each movement calculated. He moved like a man who had been to many courts, whose eyes had seen both the grandeur of thrones and the squalor of the gutters. In this den of savages, he was neither intimidated nor impressed. At the far end of the hall, Lord Haldrick sat like a wolf among sheep. He was a mountain of muscle and menace, his eyes gleaming with calculating malice as he surveyed Kael's entrance. His reputation had preceded him, a warlord whose ruthlessness had earned him the loyalty of the deadliest men in the Confederacy. Haldrick leaned back in his chair, one boot casually resting on a table covered with maps and blood-stained parchments. His hand rested lazily on the hilt of an axe at his side, the blade dark with the remains of previous conflicts. "So," Holdruk grunted, his voice like gravel, "the infamous Duke with no land, no banners, and too many whispers. You finally crawled into the light." Kael didn't falter. He didn't slow his pace as he walked directly up to the table. Without invitation, without ceremony, he pulled out a chair and sat. The entire room fell into a stunned silence. Kael made no attempt to mask his disdain for the brutish surroundings, but he held himself with the calm confidence of a man who had already won the game. "I heard you wanted to negotiate," Kael said, his voice smooth, deceptively calm. A low, guttural laugh rumbled from Holdruk's throat. "Negotiate?" He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "No, boy. I want to rewrite Historia and I need men with ambition." As if on cue, the doors to the hall groaned open. Two guards, their faces hidden behind iron masks, dragged a young woman into the room. Her wrists were shackled, but she moved with the grace of a royal. Lady Evelyn Ardent. Her name alone was enough to stir whispers throughout the Empire. She was the Emperor's niece, his most precious heir after his sons, and her capture had been a key move in the warlord's rebellion. Her gown was torn, stained with dirt and blood, and her once perfect golden hair hung in tangles. Yet even in her captivity, Evelyn's emerald eyes burned with defiance. She did not cower. She did not beg for mercy. The fire of imperial sovereignty still blazed within her, despite her chains. Holdruk's smile grew wider, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "A princess, gift-trapped." "The Emperor's niece," he said with mock affection. "Yours, if you help us crush the throne." He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial murmur. "Pledge yourself to our rebellion. You'll have hero and the power to mold the Empire in your image." Kael didn't flinch. He didn't react at all, not yet. His gaze slid to Evelyn, who met his eyes without hesitation. There was no fear in her look, only calculation. She was studying him, measuring him, as if trying to decipher the true nature of the man before her. "Good." He liked that. Kael's voice broke the tension. "And if I refuse?" A dangerous silence fell over the room. Holdruk's eyes hardened, his hand falling to the axe at his side. The weapon was sharp and ready, but it was not the steel that concerned Kael. It was the man's mind. "Then you die," Holdruk said coldly. "Your men die, and we send the girl's head to the imperial court as a message." The threat hung in the air, but Kael didn't so much as twitch. His fingers brushed lightly over the table's surface, tapping a subtle rhythm against the wood as he studied the warlord. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Then, in one fluid motion, Kael stood. His movements were fluid, a predator poised to strike. His hand slipped into his cloak, pulling a dagger from the folds of his coat. The room erupted into chaos as he moved. The western watchtower screamed first to a metal-clad figure dropped to the floor, throat slit. The eastern barracks exploded into flame, igniting with a roar that rattled the very walls of Blackthorn Keep. The warlord's men, caught off guard, scrambled in every direction, swords and axes drawn. Kael didn't move from his spot. Not yet. He simply watched as the carnage unfolded around him. His agents supplanted long before this momentum made their move with deadly precision, cutting down the warlord's forces from within. Holdruk's roar cut through the noise as he sprang to his feet, reaching for his weapon, but it was too late. Kael's dagger was in his hand before anyone noticed. A single step forward, a single thrust into the warlord's throat. The man's words died in a wet, gurgling sound as blood spilled down his chest like a crimson waterfall. Kael whispered to him, the words quiet but lethal. "You mistook the board for the game." He let Holdruk's body fall with a dull thud, leaving it in the middle of the chaos. The room erupted into violence as men fought for survival, but Kael remained unmoved. Amidst the madness, Lady Evelyn Ardent had seized a fallen sword. Her dress was stained with blood, her breath ragged as she fought with an intensity that matched Kael's own. She spun, her blade flashing through the air, cutting down one of Holdruk's closest lieutenants. She didn't speak to Kael. She didn't need to. Her eyes were locked on him, measuring, calculating, and in that moment, Kael understood. She wasn't a pawn in this game, she was a player. His hand extended toward her, a silent invitation. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then, with a decisive movement, She placed her bloodied hand in his. Not as a captive, not as a damsel, but as a piece that had decided to move on its own. The flames of blackthorn keep raged behind them as Kael led her out of the burning hall. The sky was alight with the inferno, and Kael's ice-cold, calculating air never left the horizon. This was the first move, he murmured to himself, as if reminding the world that this was only the beginning. The grand hall of the demon court was an imposing monument to power, a place where the very air hummed with ancient forces, both seen and unseen. The ceiling soared high, swallowed by an expanse of darkness that stretched beyond sight. Black marble pillars stood like sentinels, their surfaces etched with forgotten runes that pulsed intermittently, glowing faintly in shades of violet and crimson, casting strange shadows that seemed to move of their own volition. These shadows were not mere flickers of light, they whispered, whispers that clawed at the edges of the mind, sending shivers down the spines of the unwary, their words unintelligible yet unsettling all the same. Flames, impossible in their hues, floated in the air, a soul blue, deep violet, and a burning crimson that seemed to flicker with the intensity of molten infernos. These ethereal fires cast an eerie glow over the long, obsidian banquet table that stretched before the gathered demons, a table laden with delicacies that emanated an aroma both rich and taunting, the scent of roasted abyssal meats, forbidden fruits, and dark wines. The air was thick with the promise of power, and the tension was palpable, as though each moment in the hall was suspended on the brink of chaos, the fragile peace threatened by the smallest provocation. The hall was alive, filled with warlords and nobles, each bearing the weight of eons, their postures erect, but their eyes betrayed their true selves. Some of the demons had arrived with grand ambitions, hoping to secure their place at the Empress's side. Others, like predators, surveyed the room, seeking weakness, searching for a vulnerable target to strike when the opportunity arose. And in the midst of this carefully curated chaos, Clentrade, his presence as sharp as a blade, cutting through the tension like a whisper in a room full of shouts. His attire was tailored for this moment, black velvet robes trimmed with gold thread that gleamed faintly in the dim light, his cloak billowing behind him like the wings of a dark angel. His crimson eyes swept over the room with deliberate slowness, taking in every face, every movement, every thought that fluttered behind the eyes of his guests. The reaction was instantaneous. Some eyes widened with curiosity, others narrowed with suspicion. A few, in the face of Kael's cold, calculating gaze, hardened with disdain, are fools who fail to recognize the true measure of his power. His sharp gaze lingered for a moment longer on each of them, marking their faces, committing them to memory, before moving on to the next. At the head of the table, near the farthest corner of the hall, sat the demon empress herself, Selene Nightshade, a woman whose beauty could freeze the blood of even the most stalwart men. Her raven-black hair cascaded down her back like a river of midnight, and her violet gown clung to her lithe, dangerous form, embroidered with symbols of power and sovereignty. She sat with a grace that could only be described as celestial, yet the air around her was thick with the stifling weight of demonic energy. When she smiled, which she did often, it was not a smile of warmth or welcome, but a smile of command, one that made lesser beings bow without even realizing they had done so. But tonight, even Selene's beauty, even her terrifying presence, was eclipsed. At the farthest end of the hall, seated upon a throne made of onyx thorns and crimson silk, was the one whose very existence bent the will of the court. Nyx Velvet, the demon matriarch, Kael's mother. Her gown shimmered like a molten fire, as though woven from the very essence of the abyss itself. Her crimson eyes, ageless and eternal, gleamed with a soft, dangerous light. She sat perfectly still, her posture one of regal indifference, yet the space around her seemed to tremble under the sheer weight of her presence. Every demon in the room, no matter their rank or power, instinctively lowered their gaze in her direction. Even the most ancient of generals dared not meet her eyes for too long. And when her gaze found Kael, it was not the look of a mother meeting her son's eyes, but the gaze of a ruler who knew her progeny better than anyone. Kael held her stare for a beat longer than was strictly necessary, a silent challenge, an unspoken declaration of his own power. The court held its breath, for this moment was as dangerous as it was inevitable. A low, soft chime echoed through the hall, signaling the beginning of the banquet. Kael took his seat at the grand table, his eyes flicking once again to every noble, every warrior, every demonic figure that surrounded him. There was no need to speak for now. The whispers of his arrival would do the talking for him. Toasts were raised in his honor, but they were hollow, the clinking of goblets a mere formality. Kael's presence alone had shifted the balance of power in the room, and everyone knew it. Polite smiles and forced pleasantries masked the seething undercurrents of ambition and suspicion that flowed just beneath the surface. The Grand Duke of the Infernal Expanse, a massive demon whose horns were adorned with gold and obsidian, leaned forward with a wolfish grin. He was a creature of centuries, a manipulator who had survived by outwitting even the most dangerous of his peers. "Duke," he said smoothly, his voice rich with the weight of ancient authority, "your rise has been meteoric. But tell me, do you believe the Empire is truly ready for someone of your caliber?" Kael did not hesitate, his response calm, measured, and sharp as a dagger. "Only those afraid of change fear readiness." A ripple of laughter passed through the room, some demons amused by his words, others uncertain. The tension in the air thickened. This was the game that Kael played, one of words as much as power. He had already shifted the perception of the room. He was no longer a mere player. He was a force to be reckoned with. Celine, her fingers delicately tapping a single nail against her goblet, spoke next. Her voice was soft, but it carried an authority that none could ignore. "You have proven yourself, Kael," she said, her eyes flicking over him like a predator appraising its prey. "But this quarter, this Empire does not hand out power. It is taken. What is it that you seek?" The question was simple, but its implications ran deep. Kael leaned back in his chair, his crimson eyes narrowing ever so slightly as he surveyed the room. "My ambitions?" he said, his voice low, yet carrying through the hall with perfect clarity. "I seek absolute control over my destiny. Nothing more, nothing less." A hush fell over the court. The firelight dimmed, as through the very flames were reacting to the intensity of his words. The weight of his statement hung in the air, heavy and pregnant with meaning. From her throne, Nyx Velvet let out a soft, delighted laugh, one that sent a ripple through the gathered demons. "Spoken like my son," she said, her voice rich with an emotion that could only be described as both pride and menace. The court reacted in subtle ways. Some flinched, some lowered their gaze, while others merely watched, calculating, waiting for the next move. The message was clear: Kael was not just her heir, he was her chosen successor. And his ambitions were as vast as the abyss itself. But then, as if on cue, a younger noble, his eyes wide with the arrogance of youth and the intoxication of too much wine, leaned forward. "Some say your rise is unnatural," he sneered, his voice thick with condescension. Kael turned toward him slowly, the room growing colder with the change in his demeanor. His gaze, calm yet ice-cold, locked onto the foolish noble's eyes. "And others," he replied, his voice like silk over a blade, "say you'll live to see your grandchildren. Only one of those will be proven true tonight." The noble paled, the color draining from his face. No one laughed. No one dared. The atmosphere had shifted again, darker now, as the threat Kael had so casually issued sank in. The noble's arrogance faltered in the face of Kael's unwavering gaze. The room was thick with tension, every demon on edge, but it was not the words that held the court's attention. It was the waiting. And then, without warning, chaos erupted. The doors to the banquet hall slammed open with a force that rattled the pillars, the flames flickering violently in response. A blood-drenched messenger stumbled forward, his eyes wide with terror, collapsing to his knees before the Empress. "Your Majesty," he gasped, his voice ragged. "Lucian's forces have crossed the border. The northern bastions have fallen." "He rides for the abyss." The room fell into stunned silence. The fire seemed to dim, and even the shadows grew still as the weight of the news settled over the court. Lucian, the name that had haunted many of them, had crossed into their territory. For a long breath, nothing moved, and then chaos. Chairs scraped loudly as generals and warlords scrambled to their feet, shouting orders, panicking, strategizing, and pointing fingers. The illusion of control, carefully constructed over eons, shattered in an instant. Alliances formed and broke apart with the speed of shifting sand. Kael, however, did not move. His expression remained calm, unreadable, as if the storm unfolding around him were nothing more than a trivial distraction. He glanced once at Selene, once at Nyx, and then, with the slightest of smirks, turned his attention to the room of fraying power players now scrambling to salvage what little control they had. The banquet was over. The game, however, had only just begun. The grand banquet erupted into chaos. Silver goblets clattered against the polished marble floors, sending splashes of crimson wine skittering like blood stains across a battlefield. Chairs scraped against the obsidian tiles, the sound like the scraping of bone against stone. Noble demons whispered in hurried, fevered tones, a rising tide of serpents, eyes wide with a mixture of fear, fascination, and the undeniable thrill of impending conflict. The air, once thick with the scent of roasted meats and forbidden wines, now mingled with blood of the blood that stained the messenger's torn armor, staining the marble floor beneath him like an omen, foretelling the storm to come. Lucien had made his move. Kael sat in his obsidian chair, a figure of calm amidst the storm. His fingers tapped a quiet, deliberate rhythm against the carved armrest measured, unconcerned. He did not flinch at the chaos unfolding before him. In truth, it was nothing new. It was a prelude he had orchestrated, a piece of the grand game he had set into motion long ago. He had always known Lucien would fall. But to watch it happen, watching the once proud hero abandon honor for rage, morality for ambition, it was a rare delight, a scene as delicious as it was inevitable. At the far end of the hall, Nyx Velvet, resplendent in her blood-hued gown, raised her glass but did not drink. Her crimson eyes, glowing faintly in the firelight, watched the room with the cold silence of a predator. She had not spoken a single word since the messenger had stumbled in. Yet her silence, her stillness, was more deafening than any shout. It was the kind of silence that spoke of power, an ancient, suffocating power that could destroy kingdoms with a single breath. Selene Nightshade, her silver hair a halo of ethereal beauty, stood with eyes darkened by storm clouds, as if she were on the precipice of something terrible. "How many troops?" she demanded, her voice like the crack of thunder. The messenger gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts, blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. His words came in fits and starts, choked by the very life that seemed to be draining out of him. F-50,000, a broken bar led by the Holy Order's elite paladins. The northern strongholds, a broken bar, they're falling. We can't hold a broken bar. A collective hush fell over the room. 50,000 soldiers, an invasion, not just an assault. An unstoppable force, meant to crush all that stood before it. The Grand Duke of the Infernal Expanse scoffed, his golden horns gleaming like the sun on a battlefield. "So the hero finally shows his teeth," he muttered, as if Lucien's actions were little more than a minor inconvenience, a hiccup in a grander design. But Kael's voice cut through the noise, as sharp and precise as a blade drawing blood. "Number." "He shows desperation, not strength." All eyes turned toward him, drawn to the smooth, almost casual tone that betrayed none of the tension that gripped the room. Selene, her brow furrowed in disbelief, was the first to speak. "You foresaw this?" Her tone was sharp, demanding answers, as if daring Kael to admit the truth of his involvement. Kael rose from his seat slowly, the motion deliberate, not rushed, not defensive. He was the calm at the center of the storm, the eye around which everything else spun. "I guided this." His voice was low, carrying an air of finality that left no room for argument. Silence stretched across the hall, heavy and suffocating, like the moment before a great storm breaks. Even the firelight seemed to dim, as if the flames themselves were uncertain of Kael's words. Kael's gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of every demon present. Lucien no longer fights for justice. He fights because he knows he's losing. His kingdom is crumbling. His faith is hollow. He needs this war not to win but to delay the inevitable. He is grasping at a future that will never come. The Grand Marshal of the Demon Court, his face carved from centuries of war and manipulation, growled in protest. "So we let him burn our lands?" Kael's expression didn't change, his gaze unwavering. "No," he said, his voice colder now, like ice being dragged across skin. "We invite him deeper." A collective murmur ran through the court. Selene's brow furrowed deeper. "You would let them advance unchecked? Allow them to infiltrate our lands, claim victory?" Kael's lips curled into a slow, calculating smile, dangerous, sharp, and full of promise. I will encourage it. Let them believe they are winning. Let them stretch too far. When morale swells, and their formation fractures, we will strike here not with swords, but with silence. He turned, his crimson eyes locking on to Nike's mother. The demon matriarch's lips parted into a slow, delighted grin, her eyes glowing faintly as she gazed at him. Say the word. I want the shadows. A gasp rippled through the room. The velvet shadows were legends, spoken of in hushed tones, wraith-like assassins who moved between shadows like whispers in the night, unseen and unheard until it was too late. The very idea of them was enough to send shivers down the spines of even the most hardened demons. Nyx purred, her voice a low, seductive hum. You always did ask for the most dangerous toys. Kael's gaze did not waver. Will you lend them to me? You're mine, Nyx replied, her voice thick with dark affection. What's mine is yours. They leave at dawn. Selene hesitated, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. If you deploy Thema broken bar, her voice trailed off, her thoughts clouded by the magnitude of what Kael was suggesting. This will no longer be war. It will be eradication. Kael's tone dropped, becoming cold and final, as if he had crossed a line beyond which there could be no retreat. Lucian declared war the moment he crossed the line. He abandoned righteousness. Now, he will know what lies beyond salvation. No one dared to argue. No one even blinked. Kael turned back to the bleeding messenger, his crimson eyes narrowing as he took in the trembling figure before him. Tell our forces, do not retaliate. Hold the walls. Let the invaders come. Let them believe they've claimed victory. The messenger staggered out of the room, still bleeding, but with the weight of Kael's command driving him forward. As the doors slammed shut behind him, Kael turned back to face the court. His voice was steady, cutting through the rising tension like a sharpened blade. The broken bar let them drown in fear. One commander at a time, one camp at a time, one breath at a time. Nyx raised her glass in a silent toast. To inevitability, she said, her voice smooth as silk. Selene, her eyes still darkened by suspicion, slowly sat back down. Do as you see fit, Duke. But be certain of Thesa. If you fail, the Empire burns. Kael's gaze locked with hers. His crimson eyes were unblinking, full of an intensity that made the room seem to shift around him. If I fail, there will be no Empire left to burn. And with that, Kael turned, his cloak swirling behind him like a shadow made flesh. As he walked from the hall, his presence seemed to bleed into the darkness itself, as though he were becoming one with the very night. The game was no longer just unfolding, it had been irrevocably rewritten, and Kael was the one holding the pen. The banquet was over. The war had not yet begun, but the first move had already been made. Demonic borderlands. A nightfall. The night air crackled with the faintest whisper of wind, carrying the acrid scent of the earth scorched by war. Beneath the blood-red moon, the banners of the Holy Order flapped in the stillness, their gold and crimson threads trembling like the very soul of the world teetering on the brink of collapse. The Order's warriors marched with the kind of arrogance that only the truly blind possess. Swords raised, helmets gleaming like false promises of salvation, and hearts pounding with the confidence of men who believed themselves invincible. Lucian, their leader, rode at the forefront. His posture was straight, his blue eyes burning with a fierce, unyielding certainty that radiated outwards. His every movement, every word, was a proclamation of victory. He believed this was the culmination of his lifelong struggle, the righteous crusade that would save the world from the evil that lurked in the shadows. But little did he know, his victory was nothing but an illusion, a fragile mirage in the desert of his hubris. At the crest of a cliff overlooking the battlefield, Kael stood like a phantom in the night. The wind tugged at the edges of his long black coat, but he did not flinch. He surveyed the scene below him with the cold, calculating detachment of a predator watching its prey. The Holy Order's forces, confident and undisturbed, continued their march, unaware of the danger that lurked just beyond the horizon. They celebrate a death march, Kael murmured to himself, his voice barely a whisper against the howling wind. Beside him, Nyx Velvet stood, her dark silhouette blending into the night like a living shadow. The moonlight washed over her blood-red gown, making it shimmer with an eerie, almost unnatural glow. Her crimson eyes gleamed with a mixture of amusement and something darker, something that Kael had come to know as the edge of her cruel, hungry nature. You've grown into your cruelty, my love, she purred, her voice low and seductive, yet filled with the promise of violence. Watching fools choke on their own triumph. It's almost poetic. Kael's lips curled into a half-smile, but his gaze never wavered from the battlefield below. His mind was already miles ahead, spinning webs of destiny that would soon ensnare the so-called heroes who walked below. "This is not war," Kael replied, his tone cold, like the whisper of a blade. "This is prophecy inverted. I will make the world watch as its hero shatters. Lucien will be no more than a pawn in the game I have set in motion." He turned slightly to Nyx, his gaze flickering with dark intent. "Are the shadows in position?" Nyx's smile widened, a predatory gleam in her eyes. "They've already fed. The supple lines are gone in nothing but smoking ruins. The scouts? Gone without a trace. The rear guard? Surrounded. And the Holy Order's faith? It's nothing but an illusion, fragile as glass." Kael's lips curled into a wicked grin. "Good." Before Nyx could speak further, a figure emerged from the shadows, kneeling before Kael with a swift grace that only those trained in the dark arts could possess. His voice was barely a breath above the wind. "My lord, the Holy Order is feasting. They believe the cities have fallen. They've stopped watching the dark." Kael's eyes flickered with a cruel satisfaction, the flickering embers of the campfires below casting an eerie light on his face. "Then it's time." "Inform the Empress. We allow Lucien one last illusion of victory. Let him believe he's winning. Then, when he's at the peak of his triumph, we tear the world out from beneath his feet." Nyx raised a brow, her amusement evident in her gaze. "And how do you plan to break him?" Kael's gaze hardened, his voice as sharp as a blade. "We will not kill his men. We will erase them. Let him wander through ash and silence. Let him pray to gods that no longer listen. When the last of his soldiers are gone, and his victories are turned to dust, we will be waiting." Nyx's lips curled into a grin that matched Kael's. "I love your sense of drama." Lucien's campaign midnight. The night was alive with celebration, a feast fit for conquerors. The Holy Order's soldiers, drunk on their perceived victory, laughed and sang around roaring bonfires. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat, the clinking of goblets, and the sounds of revelry. Lucien, seated at the heart of this chaos, basked in the adoration of his men. His chest swelled with pride as he raised a goblet in a mock toast to his generals. "We press at dawn," he declared, his voice strong and sure, filled with the certainty of one who had already won. "The demons are shattered. Their defenses are weak. Our victory is at hand." One of his knights, the youngest of the lot, hesitated before speaking. "Sir, we've received no word from our scouts in the east." "Should we not be concerned?" Lucien frowned, his brow furrowing as he set down his goblet. "They're late. That's all. We hold the advantage. Nothing can stop us now." But even as he spoke, a shrill scream tore through the night. Then another, and another. Lucien's heart skipped a beat as the first wave of panic spread through the camp. Soldiers scrambled, their armor clattering as they drew their swords, eyes wide with fear. The fires that had once been a symbol of their triumph now seemed to mock them. In an instant, black-clad figures surged from the darkness, silent, inhuman, precise. The shadows moved with the speed of death, their bodies like wraiths, their movements fluid and deadly. They struck without a sound, cutting down the Holy Order's soldiers in their sleep, slashing throats, silencing screams before they even began. The camp descended into chaos. Tents caught fire, and the sounds of screams and dying soldiers mixed with the crackling of flames. The Holy Order's vaunted golden armor was no protection against the shadows that descended upon them. Lucien's sword flashed as he spun, cutting down one of the dark figures that emerged from the shadows. His breath was ragged, his pulse thundering in his ears. Blood soaked his boots as he turned in desperation, trying to rally his men. But the camp was a mess of chaos and terror. The once proud warriors of the Holy Order were now just animals, scrambling for survival in the night. A severed head, blackened with blood, rolled to his feet, its eyes wide with terror. Lucien's hand trembled as he stared down at it, his mind reeling. The sight of his own commander's decapitated head sent a shiver of dread down his spine. And then, his gaze lifted. Atop the hill, silhouetted against the blood-red moon, stood Kael. His black and silver form seemed to blend with the night itself. His crimson eyes glowed with cold, calculated malice, and his expression was unreadably like a god gazing down upon the destruction below. indifferent to the suffering he had caused. Lucian's breath caught in his throat. He whispered, the name more of a curse than a prayer. Kael raised a single hand, and at that moment, the massacre began in earnest. The camp became a slaughterhouse. Tents were set ablaze, men and women screamed in agony as they were torn apart, and the sound of steel tearing through flesh echoed in the night. Every escape route was cut off, every attempt at resistance futile. Lucian stood frozen, his sword still in his hand, but his mind was no longer his own. The Holy Order, his army, was being torn apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His victory, the triumph he had dreamed of for so long, was crumbling to dust before his eyes. This wasn't war. This was a spectacular play, written and directed by Kael. Lucian was nothing more than the tragic hero, doomed to fail in the end. The battlefield was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard of faith. Where once the Holy Order had marched with hymns on their lips, the night now carried only the sounds of agony, the howls of men broken not by weapons, but by a realization far deeper. The once proud encampment, brimming with sacred relics and banners aloft under the glory of the divine, was now a canvas of flame, blood, and ash. The crimson moon hovered like a sickle in the sky, casting shadows that stretched and twisted over the charred ground, mocking the holy light they had once served. The wind was thick with the stench of charred flesh, its tang suffocating every breath. The once pure golden tents of the Holy Order were now nothing more than twisted, blackened husks, collapsed into the earth like the hollow promises they represented. What had been a kingdom of piety was now a kingdom of despair. The air was suffused with an unnatural silence, broken only by the distant crackling of fire and the dying gasps of the men who had once been devout. It was not the sound of battle, it was the sound of finality. The screams, once defiant, had morphed into something more primal, something more desperate. The cries of soldiers, the noble defenders of their faith, now rang out in terror as shadows descended upon them, like wolves to a flock of sheep. No longer were the prayers to be heard, only wails of regret, horror, and helplessness. The light of divine justice, which had burned so brightly in their hearts, had been snuffed out in an instant. The holy warriors who had once stood tall and unwavering now ran like frightened animals. The clang of their swords against shadows that bled not a drop of red told the story of their impotence. Some fought back, their movements frantic and uncoordinated, but most fell to their knees, begging for mercy that would never come. In the darkened void, no one answered. Not gods, not men, not angels. Lucian staggered through the slaughter, his once pristine armor now a cracked ruin, stained with the blood of his own men. His golden kepi, once a symbol of purity and victory, dragged behind him like a funeral shroud. His eyes, once alight with the conviction of righteousness, now burned with fear. He could see the death of his comrades, hear the agony of their final breaths, feel the weight of a world that no longer recognized his holy cause. His sword, still slick with the blood of his enemies, now felt heavier than the world itself. He moved, but his steps were uncertain, as if the earth beneath him was shifting. The firelight cast grotesque shadows around him, distorting his form into a grotesque mockery of the hero he had once believed himself to be. His chest heaved with panicked breaths, his mind racing for answers, for salvation, for a way to undo the madness that had descended upon his army. The night, once filled with triumph, was now an unholy carnival of carnage. "This isn't war," Lucian muttered, his voice trembling with the weight of disbelief. "These are broken bar, this is damnation." The words echoed in the emptiness, their meaning settling over him like a cloak of despair. His Victoria, his conquestor, had been nothing more than a false illusion. And now, in the wake of his shattered dream, he was surrounded by nothing but darkness. And then, he felt it. A pressure. It was subtle at first, like a whisper in the air. But then, the weight of it became undeniable. The very air around him grew thick and oppressive, like 1,000 eyes were upon him. It was a sensation unlike anything he had ever experienced, a crushing force that made him feel small, insignificant, and exposed. It was as if the world itself had turned its gaze upon him and judged him unworthy. It wasn't divine. It wasn't magical. It was something worse. It was inevitable. Lucian's breath caught in his throat as he turned, instinctively, as if the very force of his own fear compelled him to look. His hand twitched around his sword's hilt, but it was not enough to steady him. He could feel his body betraying him, his limbs stiff with the weight of impending doom. And there, at the top of a mound of bodies atop the very mountain of his Philura stood Kael, framed by the flickering flames and the smoke that billowed around him. Kael appeared more than mortal. He was a presence. His black coat billowed in the night wind, its silver threading catching the light in eerie, hypnotic patterns. There was no blood on him, no sign that he had been part of the carnage. He was untouched, untarnished, untouchable. His red eyes, glowing like embers, pierced through the darkness like a beacon of cruelty. Kael stood there, unhurried, watching with a stillness that sent a ripple of dread through Lucien's spine. His face was unreadable, but there was something about the way he looked at Luciana, something cold, calculating, and distant that made the world seem even darker. Lucien's heart raced, but his legs refused to move. His body was frozen, his sword trembling in his hand. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stared at the man who had been nothing more than a phantom in his life, an idea, a shadow in the corners of his mind. And now, in the flesh, he was the thing that Lucien had feared most. Kael descended from the mound with deliberate steps, each one measured, as if he were savoring every moment. The shadows seemed to bend around him, obeying his will. The firelight flickered, casting an eerie glow on his face, but Kael remained untouched by the chaos around him. He was like a god among men, his very presence warping the battlefield itself. Lucien tried to speak, tried to summon the strength to stand, to fight, but his body betrayed him. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "You think this is over?" Lucien spat, his words laced with broken defiance. He gripped his sword tighter, but it felt heavier with every passing moment. "So long as I stand." Kael was gone. Lucien's breath caught in his throat. His senses screamed for him to react, to move, but it was too late. Before he could even blink, Kael was there, a shadow, a wraith. His cold blade kissed Lucien's neck, the chill of it seeping through his skin, stealing the breath from his lungs. He hadn't seen him move, couldn't even feel the wind from his movement. It was as if Kael had never been anywhere else but the very air around him. "You're trembling." Kael's voice was a whisper, a dangerous intimacy that sent shivers down Lucien's spine. It was mocking, cruel, uncompromising. Lucien's eyes widened in terror as he felt the edge of Kael's blade bite closer to his skin. He wanted to speak, wanted to call out to gods or Mina, but his voice failed him. His throat was dry. His body refused to move. He felt the ground beneath him collapse, the weight of failure dragging him into the dirt. His knees buckled, and the sword slipped from his fingers with a hollow clang. It was as if his body could no longer hold the weight of what had happened, what he had allowed to happen. Lucien collapsed, his forehead pressed into the dirt, his body trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. He could feel the weight of his own failure crushing him. The world had been stolen from him. His purpose, his faith, his very soul. Kael stood above him, his presence cold and indifferent. "Do you regret it?" Kael asked, his voice low, almost too soft for the moment. Lucien's head remained down, his body too weak to lift, too broken to answer. Regret. Could it even mean anything now? The answer was as empty as the prayers he had once held so tightly. Kael's gaze bored into him, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. "Do you regret standing against me? Against truth? Against power you never understood?" Lucien's body trembled, but he could not speak. His mind was in turmoil, his very essence unraveling before him. The once mighty knight had fallen to nothing but a craven shadow of his former self. He was no longer a hero. He was a man who had been consumed by a lie. Kael turned, and the weight of his gaze left Lucien's soul in tatters. "You never stood a chance." And with that, Kael walked away, unhurried, untouched, and unchallenged. Lucien remained on the ground, his body broken, his spirit shattered. His hands dug into the earth, as if trying to claw his way back to some semblance of the man he had once been. But it was too late. The Holy Order had not been defeated. It had been erased. Kael had not taken their lives. He had taken their purpose. The battlefield lay still, a scene of utter desolation. The fires continued to rage, casting sickly orange light across the broken landscape. The scent of smoke, charred flesh, and spilled blood clung to the air, suffocating all but the lingering stench of death. But amidst the ravaging inferno, there were no cries of anguish, no desperate clashing of steel, No fervent prayers. There were no more prayers. The holy order had been crushed. The flames licked the sky like the tongues of hell, and yet the vast expanse beneath them seemed colder than any night, colder than the deepest abyss. The silence was deafening, the kind that rings in the ears long after the storm has passed. There was no struggle left, no fight remaining. There was only Kael. He stood in the heart of the ruin, untouched, as if the destruction had never dared to come near him. His coat, dark as midnight and shimmering with silver threads that caught the firelight, hung perfectly around his form. Not a single stain, not a drop of blood, tainted his figure. His red eyes reflected the flame Issa no longer with the hint of satisfaction or pride that one might expect of a conqueror, but with a kind of stillness, a quiet certainty. He was the storm that had passed, and now, the world would forever remember its wake. Before him, kneeling, was Lucian, the hero of the Holy Order. Once, Lucian had been the beacon of righteousness, the chosen one. His very name had been synonymous with virtue. His armor had gleamed like the sun itself, a testament to the divine powers he served. His sword had been raised against the forces of darkness with the fervor of 1,000 saints, and his eyes had burned with the light of justice. Now, he was shattered. His once pristine armor was a ruin, dented, cracked, and battered. The golden plating had dulled, caked in mud and blood. His cape, which had once flowed behind him like a banner of hope, now dragged in the dirt, heavy with the weight of the battles lost. The bright blue of his tunic had turned dark with the staining blood of his comrades. His hands, shaking, trembling, dug desperately into the earth beneath him, as if trying to claw away from the weight of the world. His forehead pressed against the soaked ground, as if praying to a god that had long since turned its back. But there was no god left to answer. Kael's voice cut through the thick silence, low and final, each word weighted with a meaning that seemed to pull at the very fabric of existence. Stand. Lucian's body trembled, a spasming response to the command. But his body did not obey. His arms remained limp, his face still pressed into the dirt. The ground beneath him seemed to rise, smothering any last ounce of hope that might have still flickered in his chest. He was a hero no longer. Kael's voice came again, this time softer, but carrying an undeniable weight of finality that seemed to make the very earth tremble. I said a broken bar stand. Something in Lucian stirred, a remnant of his former self, a glimmer of the man who had once led armies, who had once held the sword of righteousness high. His fingers twitched. His spine, though weary and broken, fought to straighten. Slowly, painfully, he raised his head. His eyes were no longer the bright, unwavering flames of conviction. They were hollow. His once unshakable gaze had turned to nothingness. His face, once full of hope, was now marred by defeat. "Yeah, broken bar." His voice cracked, the words tumbling out like broken glass. "Yeah, broken bar lost." Kael's lips curled into a thin, cruel smile. The smile of someone who had seen this countless times before. "Lost?" Kael repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "Lucian, you weren't defeated. You were obliterated." Lucian's breath grew shallow, his heart pounding in his chest. The words cut deeper than any blade. The weight of them pressed down on him, crushing every shred of his former identity. He had been a hero. He had been a symbol of hope. And now, he was nothing. Kael took a single step forward, his presence overwhelming, consuming everything around him. He was the storm. He was the end. "You placed your faith in gods that never answered," Kael continued, his voice smooth and cold. "You led an army that perished without meaning. You believed yourself a hero. Look at you now." Lucian's breath hitched. His hands clenched into fists, but the rage within him felt hollow. It had no direction. It had no focus. His heart was numb, his mind a fog of confusion and disbelief. "Tell me," Kael said, crouching down until they were eye to eye. His gaze was unwavering, clinical. "What's left?" Lucian's mouth moved, but no words came out. There was nothing left to say. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to feel something or anything. But the words died in his throat, and the anger crumbled to dust. Kael leaned closer, his voice a whisper, colder than ice. "Will you fight?" Kael's eyes pierced through Lucian, his gaze searching for any last vestiges of resistance. "Will you cling to some fractured sense of honor?" Lucian's eyes flickered. He wanted to fight. He wanted to stand and take up his sword and do battle. With this cold, indifferent force that had shattered everything he had ever believed. But the strength was gone. The will was gone. What was the point? And when you realize it's futile, Kael's voice dropped to a whisper. Will you beg? The word echoed in Lucian's mind, reverberating with all the power of a death knell. Lucian flinched as if struck. The thought of begging a broken bar, of surrendering completely to the nothingness that had consumed him, it was too much to bear. His throat tightened, but the words would not come. Kael stepped back, his voice colder now, almost pitying. How pathetic. Lucian squeezed his eyes shut, as if trying to block out the truth. He trembled, his body racked with shame. His body wanted to rise, wanted to fight, but his mind and his heart refused to move. The weight of everything he had ever fought for, everything he had ever believed in, came crashing down around him. There was no God to save him. There was no hope left. Only the crushing reality that all that had been a lie. Kael turned, his footsteps slow and deliberate as he began to walk away. I will not kill you, Lucian. The words were like ice, freezing the very air around them. Lucian's heart skipped a beat. Was this some kind of mercy? Was Kael offering him a reprieve? A chance to escape? Kael turned his head, his gaze as cold as death itself. His voice was a quiet, unfeeling statement. That would be mercy. Lucian's blood ran cold. I want you to live. The words sliced through him like a blade. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to beg for it to end. But there was nothing left. No strength, no resolve. Nothing. I want you to crawl back to your broken faith, Kael continued, his voice unwavering. I want you to ask them why they abandoned you. And I want them to sigh a broken bar nothing. The finality of Kael's words struck with the force of an avalanche, leaving Lucian powerless. He had already been torn apart, and now, Kael's words made it clear. Lucian was nothing. Kael took one last step forward, his figure dissolving into the darkness, leaving only smoke and ruin in his wake. Go, Lucian. Kael's voice echoed, soft and merciless, like a death sentence. Go and learn how meaningless you truly are. And with that, Kael was gone, his presence fading like a nightmare at dawn. The silence that remained felt deeper, colder than anything Lucian had ever known. Lucian remained kneeling, broken, silent. The hero of the Holy Order no longer existed. Only a man remained, and he was shattered beyond recognition. The battlefield was silent. Not the solemn quiet of peace, nor the reverent stillness of mourning. This was a dead silence, an unnatural stillness that seemed to gnaw at the soul. The wind had ceased to blow, and even the fire's crackling seemed to recoil from the weight of what had just transpired. A heavy, oppressive quiet hung in the air, as if the very earth itself had bowed in defeat, unwilling to acknowledge the horror that had unfolded. The fires that had once raged across the battlefield now burned weakly, like the last breath of something trying to hold on to life, before it too succumbed to the void. Kael stood at the center of the destruction. His boots sunk slightly into the blood-soaked soil, and his eyes surveyed the carnage with a detached air. His coat, as pristine as ever, flowed around him like the shadows themselves. The sight of him amidst the devastation and untouched by the chaos he had wrought was a cruel testament to his power. Not a single smear of blood, not a speck of dirt marred his immaculate appearance. He was the calm in the storm, the absolute in a world of crumbling ideals. Around him, the remnants of Lucian's forces lay scattered in disarray. Broken banners that once symbolized the purity of the Holy Order now lay torn and trampled in the mud, their edges curling like the forgotten dreams of a dead civilization. Swords that had once sung with the righteousness of gods now lay cold and broken in the hands of lifeless warriors. The stench of righteousness, now burned to ash, lingered in the air, and with it, the scent of defeat, a bitter, sour odor that clung to the earth like the remnants of something sacred, now tainted. But Kael felt no triumph, no thrill, no sense of accomplishment or victory. He was not a conqueror in the traditional sense. This had never been about winning a war. He understood something others didn't, something that lay at the heart of every conflict he had ever orchestrated. This was not the final battle, not the grand clash that would bring peace or resolution. This was the beginning of something far greater. The fires burned, yes, but in the back of Kael's mind, Another fire burned more fiercely. The fire of ambition, of destiny, of power. The war he fought had only just begun. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of soft footsteps approaching him from behind. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Her presence was unmistakable. Her scent, the coolness of her aura, everything about her spoke of something distant and unyielding. "You let him live?" Celine's voice was quiet, but sharp, cutting through the silence like the edge of a blade. Kael didn't turn his gaze from the burning horizon, but the slight tilt of his head indicated that he had heard her. "He's not a threat," he replied, his voice as even and impassive as ever. Celine didn't accept that answer, stepping forward, her silver hair catching the firelight like moonlight on the surface of a still lake. Her features were sharp, her expression unreadable, though Kael could see the subtle tension in her posture. She didn't trust Lucien's survival, not after everything that had happened. "That's not what I asked," she said, her tone laced with something more than curiosity. It was a challenge, a test. Kael's gaze shifted to her for a moment. His eyes, gleaming like the deepest embers, met hers, crimson clashing with the cool, unyielding blue of her stare. "Would you have preferred I killed him?" he asked, his voice soft, but heavy with something unspoken. Celine's lips curved upward, but it wasn't a smile, not a real one. More like the faintest touch of a mask hiding something darker. "I would have preferred you made him an example. The world needs to fear you, not just respect you," she said, her voice steady and calculated. Kael's lips twitched in the faintest hint of amusement, though it was gone before it could be fully recognized. "A corpse can't carry a legacy." "But a broken man?" He glanced back at the desolation that stretched out before them, where Lucien's forces had once stood as a symbol of the Holy Order's might. "He becomes a cautionary tale." Celine studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, she gave a low, thoughtful hum. "Cruel." Kael didn't flinch. "Efficient." There was a long pause. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the faint hiss of flames, the occasional crackle of burning wood, and the eerie silence of the battlefield, the sound of an entire world collapsing in on itself. "And what now?" Celine asked, her voice laced with a quiet anticipation. Kael's gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where the smoke from the fires rose into the sky, merging with the clouds. His thoughts were far from this moment, far from Lucien, and even further from Celine. His mind was already calculating the next step in a plan that stretched far beyond the reach of this shattered battlefield. He didn't respond immediately. His thoughts were already moving forward past the Holy Order, past the fallen hero, past this moment of chaos. There were forces moving in the shadows. Forces that were more ancient, more powerful than any mortal army could ever hope to be. He could feel their gaze on him. The troop layers were beginning to make their move. Celine seemed to notice the shift in his demeanor, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. She had known him long enough to recognize when he was no longer fully present, when his thoughts reached beyond what was in front of him. "Kael?" she asked again, this time with a note of urgency in her voice. He turned to her then, his eyes glowing faintly, a subtle fire simmering just beneath the surface. He was not a man who gave answers easily, especially not now. "Now we deal with those who pull the strings," he said, his voice low and measured, as if he were speaking not just to her, but to the very world itself. Celine's frown deepened. "The Order?" she asked, though it wasn't a question. More of an inquiry about the larger picture. Kael shook his head, his eyes glinting with something darker. "The ones behind the veil. The ones who pretend to be fate." The words hung in the air like a promise, both a warning and a declaration. A shadow passed over Kael's face, here not from the flickering firelight, but something deeper, something older, stirring within him. His expression hardened. His gaze became distant, as if he could already feel their presence here hidden, watching from the darkness. The veiled ones. The shadow serpent. The Archons. Cosmic entities, whose reach extended far beyond the mortal realm, whose intentions had never been clear, but whose influence could now feel like a weight pressing down on him. Their games had only just begun. Celine's brow furrowed, but she said nothing. She simply watched him, sensing the change within him. Something was shifting. Something that Kael had long buried was resurfacing. His words were a slow rumble of inevitability. "The chains of the past are broken," Kael murmured, his voice almost a whisper. They tighten around my throat once more. Celine didn't respond, but her eyes locked onto his, her gaze now sharper, more aware. She knew what he meant. She knew what those chains were. His past, his blood lineage, his connections to forces that he had spent years trying to escape, trying to avoid, but which were now closing in on him once again. Kael closed his eyes for a brief moment, the flickering images of his past flashing behind his eyelids are memories of his mother's control, of the demons that sought to pull him back into their dark embrace. The cold indifference of the Archons, the calculating manipulations of the shadow serpent. They had never truly let him go. They had always been there, watching, waiting. But this time would be different. This time, Kael would break their chains. He opened his eyes again, his gaze steely, his resolve hardening. "Let them come," he said, his voice low and final. "They will see just how powerless they truly are." For the first time in years, Kael felt the weight of his destiny pressing against him with unbearable force. But he would not bend. He would not break. The chains of the past would be shattered, and he would be the one to wield the hammer. The throne room pulsed with restrained power. The walls, carved from obsidian, seemed to breathe with an ancient energy, their surfaces reflecting the crimson glow of the enchanted torches flickering along the edges of the room. Shadows danced like living creatures, undulating and shifting in a haunting choreography across the cold marble floor, where every inch seemed steeped in history and blood. The high ceiling above, adorned with intricate tapestries depicting the rise and fall of long-dead empires, bore down with an oppressive weight. The air, thick with the scent of incense and ancient magic, was alive with anticipation, an anticipation so thick it almost felt tangible. It was a silence that stretched far beyond the walls of the chamber, encompassing the very soul of the empire itself. At the center of it all, Kael sat upon his throne, not as a mere ruler, but as the sovereign of will. His eyes, glowing like twin embers in the dark, surveyed the scene before him. His throne, an imposing structure of obsidian and gold, symbolized his power, yet it was the stillness in his posture, the controlled rhythm of his breathing, that held the true weight. The flicker of candlelight in his gaze spoke of a mind always in motion, always calculating the next move in the grand game that stretched far beyond the borders of the empire. His fingers, long and deft, tapped rhythmically against the carved armrests, the sound echoing like the ticking of an ancient clock. Each tap was a deliberate movement, a message sent to those who surrounded him. Around him, his most trusted allies waited, their presence as palpable as the shifting air. Each of them knew the stakes. Each of them knew that they were standing at the precipice of a new era, an era that would be written in blood and fire, and at its center, Kael would be the unshakable force around which everything revolved. General Orvers, the grizzled warrior who had fought beside Kael since his earliest rise, stepped forward, his heavy boots clanging on the cold floor. His armor, battered from countless battles, gleamed with a deadly sheen under the crimson light. His face, weathered by time and battle, was grimmer through that was nothing new. But today, something was different in his gaze. The shadows in his eyes spoke of a world teetering on the edge of something far darker than mere war. "My lord," Orvers began, his voice low, filled with an unspoken respect that bordered on awe. "The Empire's council has sent an envoy. They demand an audience. Their patience thins with our broken bar acquisitions." Kael's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't one of joy. It was a smile born of the wolf's amusement before it strikes. "Do they expect me to kneel and justify my conquests?" He mused aloud, the words drifting through the air like smoke. "Charming." His tone was light, almost mocking. Yet those who knew him well understood the deadly edge that lay beneath. There was no room for negotiation. There was no space for submission, only the brutal game of dominance. Before Orvers could respond, Lillian, the master of whispers, stepped forward from the shadows. Her presence was almost ethereal, a woman wrapped in elegance and veiled intent. Her robes, embroidered with arcane glyphs that shimmered with the faintest trace of magic, were a stark contrast to the hardened warriors and generals that stood around her. She had always been the calm, calculating mind that operated in the spaces where politics and power intertwined. Her words were like fine blades, sharp and precise, capable of cutting deeper than any sword. "This isn't just diplomatic pressure," she said, her voice a soft melody that hid a razor's edge. "There are whispers, my lord. The Empire may be preparing to strike." The envoy could be a distraction, a test. Kael leaned back in his throne, his gaze narrowing as he considered her words. His crimson eyes gleamed with an unsettling calm. The wheels in his mind were already turning, plotting several steps ahead. He had anticipated this moment. The council's patience had worn thin, but that was to be expected. They had no understanding of the forces at play, of the tides that had already turned in his favor. A smile, cold and imperious, spread across his face. "Then let them test me and bleed for the mistake." He stood from the throne with a fluid motion, a predator rising to his full height. The air seemed to crackle with his presence, as if the very room acknowledged the power he commanded. His movements were deliberate, and every inch of his being exuded dominance. The assembled court, his loyal generals, spies, and advisors bowed in silent respect, though not all of them understood the depths of the game he played. "Summon the envoy," ordered, his voice a low rumble. "Let them see what it means to stand before a ruler, a broken bar, not a pawn." As Orvas and Lillian moved to obey, the room shifted once again. The temperature seemed to drop, the atmosphere growing thick with an eerie, electric charge. A shadow moved across the farthest corner of the room, and without turning, Kael knew who it was. "Am I late to the gathering?" a voice whispered, smooth and dangerous like velvet sliding over steel. The very air in the room seemed to hold its breath. "Selene Noctis." She emerged from the shadows, her every movement slow and deliberate. The flickering candlelight caught the edges of her obsidian robes, which clung to her body like a second skin. Etched with runes that pulsed faintly with demonic power, her attire seemed almost alive with its dark magic. Her silver hair cascaded down her back, glowing faintly in the dim light, and her violet eyes, ancient and unyielding, shimmered with a hunger that transcended mortal comprehension. Kael did not turn to face her. He never had to. The bond between them was so ingrained, so fundamental, that he could feel the very presence of his mother without needing to see her. "You're never late, mother," he said, his voice smooth, carrying an edge of respect, though the undertone was that of an equal, not a subordinate. "You simply arrive when the air is most still, so it trembles when you breathe." Selene's laughter filled the room. It was a sound that could seduce and destroy in the same breath, soft and chilling in equal measure. "You've grown poetic," she said, her voice warm with approval. "I approve." She moved closer, her steps as light and graceful as a predator stalking its prey. The power she exuded was almost suffocating, an aura that crushed lesser minds under its weight. When she spoke again, her voice was low, and her gaze fixed firmly on Kael. "But I come bearing unfortunate news." A ripple of tension swept through the room. Unfortunate, coming from her lips, was rarely survivable. The silence stretched out like a living thing, the only sound the faint crackling of the enchanted flames. Every eye in the room turned to Kael, waiting for his response. Selene's violet eyes locked with her son's, and for a moment, there was a silence between them, a moment where the air itself seemed to hold its breath. "The Empire is not your only concern," Selene continued, her voice laced with an ancient warning. "There are watchers beyond this realm. Old things even I would hesitate to name. They've taken note to see a broken bar and not kindly." Kael's face remained impassive, but inside, his mind raced. If Selene, she who walked between realms, warned of something, it was no mere passing threat. It was a sign that something far darker loomed on the horizon. His crimson eyes glowed faintly as he processed her words, the gears in his mind turning rapidly, calculating the potential consequences. He raised a hand, silencing the room with a single, controlled gesture. "Then let us prepare," he said, his voice low but filled with the kind of quiet authority that made even the most hardened warriors pause. "The Empire's games will be crushed, but beyond Thema broken bar we face gods who think they are untouchable." The room fell still, every eye trained on Kael. His gaze swept over the gathered court, his generals, his spies, his witches, his warlords. The pieces were in place, and yet something far more dangerous was on the horizon. The true game had yet to begin. He stepped down from his throne, moving toward the heart of the room with the grace and precision of a predator. His every movement was a calculated message. The storm was coming, and he would not merely endure it, he would command it. "We will not bend," Kael continued, his voice growing more powerful with each word. "We will not cower. This is our game now." The power in the room surged, thick and heavy, as if the very air was charged with Kael's determination. His eyes locked with Selena's, two forces that could tear worlds apart with the flick of a wrist. "And I will teach the gods how to bleed." The words rang out like a challenge, an announcement, a declaration of war. The storm had come, and Kael would not simply weather it, he would command it. The crimson glow of Kael's throne room still lingered in the air like blood, casting long, heavy shadows across the obsidian pillars and the gleaming marble floors. The room was filled with a faint, haunting flicker of enchanted chandeliers, their flames dancing nervously as if unsettled by the palpable tension in the atmosphere. Every inch of the space seemed to hum with restrained power, a force so thick that even the smallest sound seemed like an intrusion. Silence reigned in the hall, not from fear, but from anticipation. The eyes of those present, his most trusted Alyssa, were fixed on him, all waiting for the storm that was brewing behind Kael's cool, implacable facade. He sat on his throne not as a king of titles, but as a ruler of pure will. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the carved armrest of the obsidian seat, a soft sound that echoed like a ticking clock. Each beat was calculated, each movement part of a greater game. A game he had been playing for years now. A game where subtlety, manipulation, and patience were the sharpest weapons. For weeks, he had woven his influence into the very foundation of the empire. Silent conquest, subtle destruction. He had sent ripples through the nobility, and now, factions that had once opposed him now whispered his name with a mix of reverence and terror. The wheels of his machinations were turning, and it was only a matter of time before they collided with the very heart of the empire. The sound of approaching boots broke the silence. The echoes were clear, rhythmic, deliberate, each step measured. Kael didn't move. He remained as still as the shadows that surrounded him, his eyes half-lidded, calculating, assessing. The sound grew louder, drawing closer, until the doors to their throne room swung open. In walked the envoy. The figure was tall and imposing, cloaked in the gleaming robes of the empire. The gold thread in the fabric shimmered with the brilliance of the sun, and on his chest was the unmistakable symbol of the empire, a twin-headed eagle clutching a burning sword. His presence alone was enough to speak of the power he represented. Despite the grandeur of his appearance, however, Kael could see the subtle signs of uneasy tension in the set of the man's shoulders, a slight quiver in his fingers. The envoy, like all men of the empire, has been trained to hide fear, but Kael saw it. He always saw it. The man stopped before Kael, bowing low enough to show respect, but not low enough to show submission. He was carefully balanced, arrogant, but cautious. "Duke Kael Noctis," the envoy intoned in a voice as polished as it was rehearsed, "I bring greetings from the Imperial Council. I am Ambassador Aldrich Varian, messenger of His Majesty." Kael's eyes narrowed. The name was familiar, but the scent of political intrigue lingered around the man. He had likely been chosen for this task because he was too well trained to show weakness but not enough to be dangerous. He was a tool, nothing more. "Speak," Kael commanded, his voice as calm as winter, yet brimming with unspoken authority. Aldrich hesitated for the briefest of moments before continuing, his voice steady but measured. "The Empire has observed your rapid acquisitions," he said, choosing his words with care. "Your expansion into the borderlands has drawn the attention of the nobility. His Majesty requests your presence in the capital to reaffirm your allegiance and ensure continued unity among the High Lords." Kael's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The ambiguity of the request was evident. It was less a plea for unity and more a subtle warning. The Empire's fear of his growing power was palpable. They feared the shadows he had cast across the land. Lillian, ever sharp and keen to play the role, stepped forward. Her voice cut through the silence, smooth and deadly like the finest silk. "A request trapped in warning," she murmured. "The Empire must be rattled to send an envoy rather than a legion." Kael's smile deepened, but it was one of cold amusement. "So this is what they send?" His voice was laced with mockery. "A polite threat veiled in protocol, or perhaps an excuse to keep me under surveillance?" Aldrich's composure faltered ever so slightly, his fingers twitching, his jaw clenching. It was a small movement, but Kael caught it. "He always did. His Majesty values stability," Aldrich replied, the tension in his voice barely hidden. "You've massed great power, Duke. This is not punishment, to it is recognition, a broken bar and concern." The words were carefully chosen, but Kael could taste the underlying meaning. The Emperor feared him, and that fear was the most dangerous thing a ruler could have. From the far shadows, a voice like velvet and poison drifted through the air, smooth and melodic. "Concern," it purred, "is often the word cowards use to mask fear." The room seemed to hold its breath, as Selene Noctis emerged from the darkness, her very presence shifting the atmosphere. She moved with the grace of a predator, her obsidian robes trailing behind her like liquid night, the runes woven into the fabric pulsing with dark power. Her silver hair gleamed under the dim light, cascading down her back like a river of moonlight. Her violet eyes gleamed with the kind of hunger that made even the bravest of men question their very existence. Aldrich's skin turned a shade paler as her gaze met his. "You stand before the son of House Noctis," Selene continued, her voice dripping with venom. "You bring veiled demands from a dying throne. Perhaps your masters have forgotten we do not kneel." Aldrich visibly stiffened, his face a mask of professional detachment, but Kael could see the fear in his eyes. The man's composure was cracking, but he was too proud to show weakness. "Not yet." "With respect, Lady Noctis," he began, his voice strained but still dignified, "this is not a command. It is an opportunity for peace." Kael chuckled, a soft, mocking sound that echoed like the calm before a tempest. "Peace?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "I've read that word in the same line as surrender too many times." He rose slowly, the movement like the unfolding of a storm. As he descended from the throne, the room seemed to tilt around him, and every eye followed his every movement. The very air in the room seemed to crackle with power, and Kael relished the sensation. "Tell your emperor this," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "If he wishes words, he may come to my court and speak them. I do not answer summons like a dog." Aldrich's lips tightened, his composure slipping further. "Refusal may be interpreted as rebellion," he warned, though the words lacked conviction. Kael's smile was cold, cruel, and utterly unmoving as he stepped forward, inches away from Aldrich. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of his presence. "Then let them interpret," Kael said softly, his tone low and dangerous. "Let them send their legions. Let them try." The guards around the envoy stiffened, their hands inching toward their weapons, their eyes flickering with the unmistakable signs of growing tension. Even Orvers, the ever-loyal general, had his hand resting near the hilt of his sword, the muscle in his jaw clenching. Kael halted, standing face to face with Aldrich. His gaze pierced through the envoy like a blade, the power radiating from him overwhelming. He leaned in slightly, his voice soft, but carrying the weight of destiny. "This is not the capital," Kael said, his voice as cold as the depths of the abyss. "This is my land. And here, your emperor's will is dust beneath my boots." The words struck with the force of 1,000 thunders. And though Aldrich stood firm, Kael could see the fear settling in his eyes. The envoy was no longer in control of the conversation, no longer in control of the room. He was a pawn, and Kael had already moved him. Aldrich, despite his shock, bowed deeply, too deeply, perhaps, for the pretense of diplomacy to remain intact. "I will deliver your message," he said, his voice tight, his movements stiff. Kael gave no response, just a dismissive gesture with his hand as he turned away. The audience was over. As the envoy was led out, the room fell back into its eerie, charged silence. Kael, however, did not sit immediately. He stood at the edge of his throne, his gaze fixed on the door where Aldrich had disappeared. His eyes gleamed, burning with the fire of something far greater than mere mortal ambition. Selene's voice cut through the stillness. "They will not forgive your defiance." Kael turned to her, his expression unreadable, but his lips curled in a slow, predatory smile. "Good," he said softly. "Let them come. Let them try." Lillian, ever the strategist, stepped closer to Kael, her green eyes gleaming with both curiosity and eagerness. "Shall we prepare for war?" she asked, her voice low, almost purring with anticipation. Kael's smirk returned, slow and cruel. "Not yet. Let them think I've overreached. Let them play their little game." He turned back to the throne, the crimson cloak he wore billowing behind him like the wings of a shadow. "We'll play it better." And when the time comes, a broken bar, his eyes gleamed with a ferocity that was nearly palpable. "A broken bar, they'll kneel because I'll leave them no other choice." The room trembled under the weight of his words. The Empire had sent a message. Kael had answered. And now, the game was his. The Empire no longer controlled the pieces. The board had been shifted, and the future would be written in blood. The Imperial Palace stood before Kael, an enduring symbol of faded might. Its marble towers reached high, veins of gold woven into the stone like intricate threads of a decaying tapestry. The far A-section was magnificent, pristine, an illusion of power that held sway only for as long as it remained untouched by scrutiny. Beneath the polished exterior, Kael knew well, the palace was rotten to its core. Secrets lingered in its halls, corruption clung to its walls, and the iron grip of the Emperor's reign had long since begun to slip. It was a beautiful ruin, and Kael had come to claim it. As his carriage came to a slow stop within the grand courtyard, the air shifted. A quiet tension rippled through the onlookers. Guards, nobles, and high-ranking officials all had turned their eyes to him. Not as a mere duke, not as a man of title, but as something more, a harbinger of the storm, the reckoning they had all been dreading. His black coat, trimmed in crimson, billowed slightly in the evening breeze, and his sharp, calculating gaze, red as blood, betrayed no emotion. He did not come as a guest. He did not come to bend the knee or beg for favor. He came because the Empire could no longer pretend he didn't exist. Kael's eyes flicked to the imperial seal embossed on the parchment in his hand. The Emperor's formal invitation was unmistakable. Yet the detail, the subtle, almost imperceptible stroke of sapphire in the wax, told another story. This was no mere royal summons, it was a message from Selenoryx, the Empress herself, the true power behind the throne. She had asked to meet him, alone. It was rare for the Empress to make such an invitation, rarer still for her to ask for a private audience with someone of Kael's caliber. His curiosity stirred as he made his way through the palace's opulent corridors, the faintest whisper of his boots on the polished marble floors sounding louder than usual in the oppressive silence that enveloped him. The gardens are usually teeming with life, full of noble gatherings and whispered intrigues, were eerily still as Kael stepped into the moonlit space. The sharp scent of night-blooming jasmine filled the air, mingling with the earthy fragrance of damp stone. White blossoms shimmered beneath the pale moon's gaze, their petals seemingly frozen in time. There, beneath the shade of an ancient willow, stood Selenoryx, the Empress. Her presence alone seemed to bend the very atmosphere around her. She turned as he approached, her gown of deep sapphire velvet swelling around her like a night sky unfolding. Her golden hair gleamed under the moon's glow, cascading in perfect waves down her back, while her skin, pale as the finest porcelain, caught the light in delicate contrast. Her violet eyes met his, sharp, calculating, dangerous. She was a woman who understood power not just in its raw form but in its subtleties. Every movement, every word, every glance was calculated. She was not the fragile beauty she appeared to be. She was the storm that hid beneath the calm. "You came," she said, her voice a perfect blend of velvet and steel. The words were not a question, but a statement. One that held weight, one that demanded acknowledgement. The Empress was not surprised by his presence here. She had known he would come. The game was already in motion, and Kael was the most dangerous piece on the board. Kael did not bow. He did not speak at once. He simply stood, regarding her with the same icy composure that had earned him the respect and fear of so many. "I was curious," he said, his voice low but edged with the sharpness of steel. "The Empress rarely makes idle invitations. When she does, it is never without reason." A smirk tugged at Selene's lips as she took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. "Nor do you, Kael. That's why we both know this was inevitable." Kael's eyes narrowed slightly, the only indication that her words had struck a chord. He was no fool. He understood the game she was playing, and he was more than prepared to engage. The world of the Empress, of the Empire, was built on manipulation, power, and veiled threats. But he was no mere pawn in her plans. He was the king she had yet to recognize. She turned her gaze skyward, as if contemplating the stars, her voice carrying a weight that Kael could not ignore. "Lucius believes you are still a pawn, one to be boxed in and controlled. He does not see the king you are becoming. That blindness, Kael, broken by that blindness, will cost him his throne. Kael's expression remained unchanged, but his mind worked quickly, turning her words over. Luciusa the Emperor was a fool, a man who clung to a crumbling empire as if it could still stand. He was blind to the shifting tides, to the power that had already begun to slip through his fingers. The emperor's reign was nothing more than a facade, a dying illusion. And in the shadows, men like Kael and Selene were already preparing to strike. "And what do you see, Empress?" Kael's voice was calm, but beneath it lay an edge of challenge. He had no time for games of false courtesy. If she wished to speak plainly, he would listen. She looked back over her shoulder, her lips curling into a small smile. "I see a man who never plays to lose." Selene's words were like a knife, cutting through the distance between them. There was no flattery in them, no artifice. She spoke only the truth, a truth that Kael could feel deep in his bones. She was not one to shy away from the truth, and perhaps, just perhaps, that was why she intrigued him. Without another word, she closed the distance between them. Her center rich with jasmine and something darker, something more primal, surrounded him. Every step she took was deliberate, each motion an act of grace that carried with it a promise of power. "You fascinate me, Kael," she whispered, her voice soft, almost intimate. "You command loyalty without chains. You take power without screaming for it. You don't conquer kingdoms, or you bend them." Kael tilted his head, his gaze unwavering. "Flattery from an empress?" he asked, a thin smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "What do you want, Selene?" Her violet eyes met his with a quiet intensity. There was no answer at first, only the heavy silence that stretched between them. And then, at last, she spoke, her words barely above a whisper. "I want to survive," she said, her voice low, laden with a quiet vulnerability that Kael had not expected. "And I want to rule." Kael stepped forward, closing the space between them. His presence, like a storm gathering force, seemed to overwhelm her. His voice was low, a breath against her ear. "Then tell me, are you done serving a fool?" Selene's expression did not change. Her composure never wavered. But her eyes, those violet eyes, spoke volumes. They held a truth that she had not yet dared to voice. "Not until now." "I have served the Empire," she said, her voice steady, "not Lucius." "Never him." Kael's hand reached out, his fingers brushing a stray lock of her golden hair from her shoulder. His touch was light, but it held an undeniable power. She did not flinch. She did not pull away. She simply stood, waiting for him to move again, to make his next move. "The empire is crumbling," Selene whispered, her voice low, the words heavy with the weight of her own quiet rebellion. "And I would rather rise with you than fall with him." Kael smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips. "Then it begins," he said, his voice thick with the promise of a new dawn. Selene placed a hand on his chest, her fingers cool against his skin. She rested them above his heart, a quiet admission of trust, of allegiance. "Power like yours terrifies them," she murmured, her voice soft. "But it excites me." Kael leaned in, his breath brushing against her ear. "Good," he said, his voice a low growl. "Because I'm not here to be accepted. I'm here to be inevitable." The night air seemed to grow heavier as their eyes locked, two predators circling each other, sensing the delicate balance between them. This was not a meeting of allies, not yet. But it was the beginning of something far more dangerous, far more potent. An alliance forged not in mutual trust, but in ambition. An alliance that would break the empire apart from within. They had spoken the unspoken, and now there was no turning back. The Empress had made her choice. Kael had made his. The Empress's private chambers were draped in crimson velvet, shadows coiling in the corners like silent watchers, bearing witness to secrets older than the Empire itself. The flickering candlelight cast elongated figures across the polished stone floor, distorting reality, creating a world suspended between the present and a future that was far from certain. The room was far from a place of respite. It was a throne behind the throne, a sanctum of power where the true struggles of the Empire were fought. And tonight, those struggles took on a sharper edge. Kael stood before the wide-arched window that overlooked the imperial courtyard below. His crimson eyes were fixed, unblinking, as the figures of nobles moved in the gardens, their delicate gowns and silks fluttering in the soft breeze. their laughter carrying up to him like the notes of a forgotten melody. They moved like puppets, believing themselves to be in control, believing they held the strings. But he knew better. The empire was crumbling beneath the weight of its own greed, and the only thing holding it together was the precarious balance of fear and illusion. Behind him, the soft sound of fabric sliding against itself echoed in the room as Selene Oryx, the Empress, reclined on a chaise draped in blood-red velvet. The stem of a wine goblet danced between her delicate fingers, its contents shimmering in the soft glow of the candles. Her eyes, those piercing violet orbs, never strayed from him. She was calculating, patient, watching him as though he were the only thing that mattered. "You've done well," she said, her voice like silk, smooth and deceptive, hiding the steel beneath. "They speak your name in hushed tones, with reverence, fear, or perhaps both. But they speak it all the same." Kael did not turn, his gaze still fixed on the distant courtyard. "And you, Empress? Do you speak it with fear, as they do?" Selene's lips curved upward in the smallest of smiles. "No," she said, the word like a quiet promise. "I speak it with caution and interest." Kael allowed a silence to fall between them, the tension thick in the air. Then, slowly, he turned, his movement deliberate. The candlelight caught his features, revealing nothing but the calm, unreadable mask he had perfected over the years. His expression was a stone wall, but there was a sharpness in his gaze, a hunger that never left. "You summoned me for more than flattery, I assume," he said, his voice low and even. Selene, with her grace and beauty, rose fluidly from the chaise, her gown trailing behind her like a whisper. She crossed the chamber with the quiet precision of a predator, her every step calculated. The scent of jasmine followed her, mingling with something darker, more elusive. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could feel the heat from her body, the faint tremor of power that radiated from her. "I summoned you because the Empire is dying," she said, her voice a quiet revelation, a soft confession of truth. "And you may be the only one ruthless enough to hold it together." Kael's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, the tension in the air thickening. He could feel the dangerous weight of her words settling between them. But he would not be manipulated. "Not yet." "Careful, Selene," he warned softly, his voice a dangerous lull. "You're dancing dangerously close to treason." She met his gaze, her violet eyes gleaming with a sharp, knowing glint. "Am I?" she asked, a note of amusement threading through her voice. "Or am I simply acknowledging the truth before it becomes fashionable to do so?" Her hand reached out, a delicate and purposeful gesture. She tested the boundaries, the air between them charged with an unspoken challenge. Her fingers brushed the sleeve of his dark coat, light and fleeting, but it was enough to send a ripple through the space between them. Kael's hand shot out, swift and unyielding, catching her wrist mid-air. His grip was firm, but it held no malice. It was a warning, an unspoken message that she had crossed a line. "You test me," he murmured, his gaze intense. "I measure you," she corrected, her voice calm but firm. "If I were playing, you'd already have won." Kael's gaze flicked over her, calculating, studying her every movement. He released the wrist, his hand falling away like the completion of a judgment. He did not fear her, he respected her, but only because she had the ambition and intelligence to play a game as dangerous as his own. "Then stop measuring, and speak plainly," he said, his voice a low command, stripped of pretense. Selene turned gracefully, her back to him now as she crossed the room toward a large desk cluttered with scrolls, letters, and maps of the Empire. With a flick of the wrist, she retrieved a sealed letter, its wax stamp bearing the insignia of the Western provinces. She held it up for him to see, her face unreadable. "The Western provinces are fracturing," she said, her voice growing more serious. "The governor speaks of a faction rising, a small now, but vocal. They call for a new order, one free from Lucius's rule." Kael took the letter from her, his gaze flicking over the contents quickly. Each word, each sentence, was a crack in the Empire's foundation. The governor's rebellion was a whisper now, but it could grow. And that would be an opportunity for both of them. "You see rebellion," he murmured, the weight of his thoughts already turning over in his mind. "I see opportunity," she corrected softly, her voice tinged with something dark and calculated. "Opportunity that needs a sculptor." Kael stood in silence for a moment, considering her words. It was not rebellion she saw to, it was succession. She wasn't asking him to lead this new faction. No, she wanted him to shape it, to mold it quietly until it grew too large to ignore, until it was inevitable, until Lucius, in his arrogance, had no choice but to watch it consume him. "You want me to lead it," he said, his tone flat. Selene shook her head, the corner of her mouth lifting in a small, knowing smile. "I want you to shape it, quietly, behind the scenes, until it's too large, too strong, and Lucius is left grasping at shadows." Kael set the letter down on the desk, his mind already racing with possibilities. The pieces were falling into place. The rebellion was not an end, it was a beginning. And he would not waste an opportunity to strike. He wasn't just a player in this game. He was the one who made the rules. "I don't take crowns," he said, his voice low but firm. "I don't need them." Selene's smile widened, a glint of something dark passing through her eyes. "You make people beg you to wear them." Kael's lips twitched into a small smile, one that was all calculation and purpose. It was not a smile of amusement, but of understanding. The room fell into silence once again, but this time it was heavy with intention, with plans already set in motion behind their eyes. Neither of them would be the same after this night. They would shape the empire in their own image, and those who stood in their way would crumble. Kael moved toward the door, his coat swaying behind him like a shadow. Before he stepped into the hall, he paused, his hand on the doorframe. He didn't turn back, but his voice carried, low and steady. "Have your agents wait for my signal," he said, each word weighted with finality. "When it comes a broken bar, the empire will begin to break." Selene's voice followed him, soft and almost wistful. "And what of Lucius?" Kael's hand remained on the doorframe for a moment longer, his eyes closed for just an instant, the weight of the coming storm settling over him. Then he answered, his voice a dark promise. "He's already in chains," he said, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "He just hasn't noticed yet." And with that, Kael stepped out into the night, the door closing behind him with the finality of a chapter closing an empire on the brink of collapse, its fate already sealed. The grand halls of the imperial palace trembled with restrained energy. Beneath the surface of noble pleasantries and ceremonial grandeur, something darker pulsed, an unspoken storm gathering at the heart of the empire. The lights above gleamed, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twine like serpents, stretching across the marble floors and high walls. Kael moved through the hall with the fluidity of a predator, every step deliberate and quiet, his presence slicing through the murmur of conversation. The soft rustle of silk echoed beneath the heavy air, the only sound that dared speak against the suffocating silence that followed him. Dressed in obsidian silk, his robes trimmed with silver thread, Kael looked less like a court official and more like a figure of death himself, a master of hidden power, an executioner cloaked in civility. His mere presence turned conversations into whispers, whispers into silence. The long, polished table stretched before him like a battlefield, its dark wood gleaming beneath the lights of the chandelier above. At its head sat Empress Selene, as poised and enigmatic as ever. Draped in violet silk that shimmered like the night sky, her every movement was a study in grace and calculated elegance. She was the heart of the court, but tonight, she had been forced to share the throne's shadow. She held herself with the quiet confidence of a ruler, but even she couldn't mask the wariness in her eyes as she studied the man before her. Kael stopped before the table, and for a moment, the air seemed to constrict. Every noble seated around the table stiffened, their gazes flicking toward him, then away, as if they could hide their unease. They had all heard of Kael's exploits. They knew the rumors, the whispers of his growing influence, of his ruthless strategies. But hearing them, and seeing him in person, were two different matters entirely. "Lord Kael," Selene's voice broke the silence. It was smooth as velvet, but underneath lay a cold edge, a calculated sharpness. "You command more attention than the Emperor's decrees these days." "Tell you, sir, what does one do with such dangerous attention?" Kael's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. It wasn't a smiley, it was a warning, a promise of something far more potent than any words could convey. "Attention is a currency," he said smoothly, his voice carrying effortlessly to every corner of the room. "And I never spend without a purpose." A ripple of tension ran through the nobles. The older ones masked it with practiced stoicism, their faces carefully composed. The younger ones, the ambitious ones, weren't so adept at hiding their fear. Kael could taste it on the air, like a bitter scent. Before Celine could respond, the chamber doors groaned open, their heavy oak doors creaking on their hinges. A figure stepped inside, draped in a cloak of deep grey, the uniform of the Imperial Shadows, an elite cadre of spies and assassins. Their very presence was enough to chill the air. Where they walked, silence followed. Their missions were never ordinary. The figure moved with a fluid, almost predatory grace, approaching the table with the same quiet intensity that Kael himself exuded. The Shadows bowed low, a practiced gesture that conveyed both respect and submission, before offering a scroll sealed with the mark of the Imperial Intelligence Order. Kael's gaze flicked over to the parchment as the Shadow placed it before Celine, who unrolled it with a single flick of her finger. Her eyes scanned the text quickly, then again, slower this time. Her brow furrowed as she read, her knuckles whitening as the information settled into her mind. Her gaze flicked up, locking with Kael's, and for a fleeting moment, there was something cold in her eyes, a flicker of unease. "This is no longer a matter of court politics," she said, her voice carrying through the chamber like the low toll of a distant bell. The nobles went still. Even those who had been engaged in idle chatter fell silent, their gazes darting between Kael and Celine, as if waiting for the next step of this tense play. Kael's mind raced. His gaze shifted from Celine to the scroll, his eyes narrowing as he took in the details, without looking at her. He spoke, his voice calm and measured. "The borders?" Celine met his eyes and nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes, beyond the northern mountains. Our scouts report strange movements, an organized force, hidden beneath storms and shadows." A name none of us expected to hear again. Kael did not blink, his expression unfaltering. His thoughts were already spinning. He had known something was coming. He had sensed it. The whispers of the Empire's weakening grasp on its outer territories, the increasing unrest. The cracks had begun to show in the Empire's far section aid. But these a broken bar. This was something different. This was a challenge unlike any other. "Who leads them?" he asked, his voice even, though his mind was already putting the pieces together. Celine hesitated, just for the briefest moment, a flicker of something hidden in her eyes. And then, she spoke the name. "The Nightborn Legion." The name fell into the room like a blade, sharp and final. A gasp escaped one of the nobles, and another's wine glass shattered against the marble floor in shock. Some of the older generals at the table leaned forward, their faces stricken with disbelief. The younger ones, those eager to prove themselves, exchanged wide-eyed glances, too frightened to speak. But Kael, a broken bar, remained still. His mind had already shifted gears. The Nightborn were no mere myth or legend. They were an empire forged in shadow, born of blood and silence. An army that had made a name for itself not in the open fields of battle, but in the darkness of forgotten history, sweeping through empires like a plague, leaving nothing but death in its wake. 1,000 stories had been whispered about them. Their black banners had been seen in the ruins of fallen cities. Their faceless commander was said to be a wraith, a shadow, a being who would strike without warning and vanish before his enemies knew what had happened. To face them was to face oblivion. But Kael's mind was far from scared. He had already begun to piece together the story. The Nightborn didn't move on their own. There was a hand behind them, guiding them. Someone had summoned them. And that someone was here, in this very room. He let the silence stretch on, savoring the palpable fear in the air. Then, Kael did something unexpected. He laughed. It was a quiet, almost affectionate chuckle, but it echoed too loudly in the chamber, far louder than it should have been. Celine's gaze snapped toward him, sharp and unreadable. "You find these a broken bar funny?" Kael's eyes gleamed like polished obsidian. "Not funny," he murmured. "Expected." The tension in the room ratcheted up. The nobles shifted uncomfortably, exchanging confused glances. Some of them opened their mouths to speak, but Kael silenced them with a single, cold glance. "You think someone inside the Emperor, inside this quarter, summoned them?" one noble asked, his voice trembling with disbelief. Kael moved forward, his steps slow but purposeful. He reached the edge of the table, and for a moment, he seemed to loom over the gathered nobles, his presence pressing against their senses like a tangible weight. "I don't think it," he said softly, his words dripping with certainty. I know it. He turned his gaze on each face in the room, letting them feel the weight of his scrutiny. Panic, anger, guilt, but also composure. Too much composure. In a few cases he could see it, he could feel it. He was looking at the faces of traitors. One of them, perhaps more than one, had already made a deal with the Nightborn. Armies do not march from forgotten legends unless guided, Kael continued. The Nightborn have no desire for conquest or broken bar unless they are promised something greater. He let the words linger in the air, each syllable loaded with implication. He could see the realization dawning in their eyes, the slow, sinking weight of guilt and fear. And that means someone within this chamber has already made a pact, he said, his voice like ice. A traitor, perhaps more than one. The nobles froze. Some of them looked at each other, their eyes darting nervously. Others quickly looked away, their faces pale and their hearts racing. But Kael knew the truth. One of them had already betrayed them. Celine leaned back in her chair, her face impassive, though Kael could see the glint of calculation in her eyes. "And what would you suggest, Lord Kael?" she asked, her voice low, dangerous. "That we begin hunting shadows without proof." Kael smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "No," he said softly. "We do something far more effective." He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough for Celine to hear alone. "We let the traitor believe they have already won," he whispered. "That their plan is working. That we are fractured, panicked, blind. We let them believe they are untouchable. And then, when they least expect it." He stepped back, his eyes gleaming. "We make them an example, a message to the Nightborn, and to whatever gods they pray to." Celine met his gaze, her lips curling into a slow, satisfied smile. "Then let the game begin, Lord Kael," she said, her voice cold as steel. The Imperial Hall, once the grand center of power and elegance, was now an arena silent, suffocating, and heavy with the weight of unsaid words. The air felt thick, and each breath seemed to carry the full measure of the tension that had taken root among the assembled nobles. They sat frozen in place, caught in the moment between Kael's declaration and the inevitable storm that would follow. His words hung in the air, lethal in their simplicity. "A traitor among us." Empress Celine, the regal queen of this poisoned court, sat unmoving in her obsidian throne, her fingers tapping softly on its armrest, each measured strike of her fingertips marking time, like the ticking of a clock counting down to an unknown event. It was a rhythm of control, of precision, a calm exterior masking the brewing fury inside. The steel beneath her beauty was unmistakable, but tonight, it was laced with something else. Intrigue. Kael was a shadow in the room, his presence impossible to ignore. Every noble, every lord, every general knew that his mind was a weapon sharper than any blade in the Empire. He wielded it with subtlety and cunning, and they feared what he might turn it on next. The silence stretched on, nearly unbearable, until Kael spoke again, his voice breaking it like a thread pulled taut to the breaking point. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were deliberate, each one carrying the weight of a heavy judgment that none in the room could easily ignore. "I propose we do not flinch," he said, his eyes cold as ice, unblinking. "If we act now, the traitor scatters, hiding further into the darkness. But if they believe their deception remains unseen, they will grow careless." Celine's gaze was unwavering as she met his, eyes sharp like knives. There was no softening in her expression, but something flickered there, almost an approval, hidden beneath the mask of her imperial poise. "And if their next mistake kills?" Her voice was soft, a low growl, but her meaning was clear. Kael met her gaze without hesitation, his lips curving ever so slightly, a subtle smile that was more a statement than an expression of amusement. "Then we make sure it is the last thing they ever do." For a long moment, neither moved, their eyes locked in silent communication. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to snap. The nobles shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. Kael, however, was a figure carved from stone. His presence seemed to loom larger than the room itself. It was Duke Alva, the bloated, overconfident military officer, who broke the fragile silence. His voice came like a bark, sharp and accusatory, a desperate attempt to assert control. "This is arrogance, he snarled. You speak of strategy as if this court were your personal war table. We cannot let some shadow plot grow unchecked. Kael's gaze turned slowly toward the Duke, and for a brief moment, Alva's bravado faltered. Kael didn't even need to raise his voice. And yet, Duke, you already have, he said, his words carrying an unspoken weight that seemed to crush the very air between them. Alva stiffened, the redness in his face deepening. What did you say? He demanded, his voice rising, a defiant edge creeping into his tone. Kael's eyes narrowed just slightly, but it was enough to send a chill down the spine of everyone watching. You speak of danger. While sitting in velvet, feasting on fear, Kael continued, his voice low, like a predator toying with its prey. Tell me, Duke, are you more outraged by the presence of a traitor or a broken bar, or by the thought that I might be the one to find them first? A murmur of unease swept through the room, but Kael didn't wait for a reply. He allowed the silence to stretch again, letting it crackle with tension. The Duke was visibly rattled now, his face flushed and his jaw clenched tight. But Kael had already turned away, as if dismissing him entirely, his attention moving elsewhere. Selene had remained silent during the exchange, watching with a calculating gaze. Her eyes never left Kael, not even when the room seemed to hold its collective breath. She wanted to see just how far he would push. I offer a solution, Kael said, his voice now more purposeful. The room leaned in, hanging on his every word, every syllable. We force the traitor's hand, present a threat they cannot ignore, a shift in power that tips the scales out of their control. Selene raised an elegant brow, intrigued but still cautious. And what form will this a shift take? Kael smiled, the expression cold and calculating. Make me supreme commander of the Imperial forces. The room erupted into chaos. Shouts rang out, a mix of disbelief and panic, the air thick with the weight of the proposition. Some nobles shot up from their chairs, while others leaned forward, their eyes wide with a mix of interest and fear. The general murmurs of unease turned into heated protests. They had expected many things from Kael, but this was a step beyond anything they had anticipated. Alva, the Duke who had so boldly confronted Kael earlier, was the first to respond. His voice cracked with fury as he rose from his seat. This is madness, he spat. You want to hand him control of our entire military machine? Kael didn't even flinch at the outburst. His expression remained calm, his gaze fixed steadily on the Duke. Worried your men would prefer loyalty to competence? The words landed like a slap across the room. Even Alva recoiled for a moment, his face tightening in rage, but Kael's words had struck deep. The nobility knew that rather many of their military leaders, especially those with power like Alva, were more concerned with maintaining their positions than they were with the Empire's true strength. It was this very complacency that had made the Empire vulnerable, and Kael knew it. Selene's hand rose slowly, her fingers sharp and commanding, silencing the room instantly. The nobles fell back into their seats, their eyes flicking between Kael and the Empress, waiting for the next move. Kael stepped forward, his voice now a low, persuasive murmur that cut through the tension like a blade. The traitor believes the game belongs to them, he said, each word drawn out as if to emphasize its weight. Let them think I am their greatest threat. Let them fear me more than they fear exposure. That's how we find them. Selene's eyes flashed. There was an edge of something deeper in her gaze, intrigue, admiration, even. She leaned forward, her lips curling into a smile, one that was barely perceptible, but no less dangerous for it. I see you thought this through, she said, her voice soft yet icy. But I do not give power lightly. I don't ask, Kael replied smoothly. I offer results. There was a pause, long, drawn out as Selene considered his proposal. Her fingers tapped once more against the armrest, and for a brief moment, the entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. The Empress, so used to holding power in her hands, now stood at a crossroads. Finally, she spoke, her words sharp as the blade of a sword. The Frost Vale Highlands burn, she said, her gaze never leaving Kael's. If you subdue them within 1 month, the title is yours. Kael nodded slowly, a sense of finality in his gesture. Consider them quiet, he said, his voice devoid of any hesitation. Objections? Selene asked the court, her voice laced with a chilling calm. The room was utterly still. Not a single noble spoke. Alva opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face twisted in impotent rage, but he could not defy the Empress, nor could he stand against the sheer power of Kael's influence. Celine's voice turned to silk as she spoke again, dismissing the matter with cold finality. Then it is decided. Lord Kael departs at dawn. As the nobles began to filter out of the room, a few still casting wary glances in Kael's direction, he remained behind, his boots clicking softly against the marble floor. He approached Celine's dais, where she remained seated, her posture regal and unyielding. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, neither moved. Then Celine spoke, her voice low but carrying an edge. "You enjoy this game far too much." Kael's lips twitched, a smile that never reached his eyes. "And you enjoy watching me win it." For the briefest of moments, Celine's expression softened, a flicker of something akin to amusement in her gaze. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the calculating poise of the Empress. "Perhaps," she said softly, almost to herself. Kael turned, walking away with a deliberate slowness that suggested there was more at play here than even he let on. As his footsteps echoed through the chamber, Celine remained seated, her eyes lingering on his retreating form, her thoughts veiled behind the calm surface of her expression. But somewhere in the shadows of the room, the traitor watched. Their fists clenched tight, hidden from all eyes. The war had already begun. The moon hung like a silver shard in the sky, casting pale light over the sprawling imperial city below. From the highest balcony of the imperial palace, Kael surveyed the land with the calm precision of a man who saw the future as clearly as the present. His silhouette, outlined against the vast stretch of night, was a study in control, each angle sharp, each line honed to perfection. Beneath him, the empire stretched a labyrinth of gold-tipped towers, flickering lights in the streets, and shadows dancing in the alleys where power and danger alike lurked. Yet, beyond the comfort of the city's grandeur lay the Frostvale Highlands, a barren and unforgiving landscape, an empire's forgotten frontier, where rebellion stirred like an ancient beast waiting to awaken. The land was cold, inhospitable, and rebellious to its core. But not for long. Kael's eyes narrowed, his thoughts drifting to the task ahead. The rebellion would break beneath the weight of his will, its bones crushed under the unstoppable march of empire. No more delays. The frost would crack beneath his feet, and the rebels would know their place. His grip tightened on the railing before him, the cold stone a reminder of the weight on his shoulders. Behind him, the sound of footsteps grew closer, soft, deliberate, a presence that didn't need to announce itself. Kael didn't turn, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. He didn't need to look to know who it was. "You're leaving at dawn." Celine's voice was smooth, like silk pulled taut over the edge of a blade. It was a statement, not a question. Kael's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, a private expression he reserved for those who truly understood the game. "Yes," he replied, his tone steady, unwavering. "The Empire has left its mess unattended for too long." She stepped up beside him, her presence radiating power, but there was something in her eyes, something dangerous that flickered behind the usual imperial poise. Violet eyes glinted beneath her silver tiara, reflecting the distant starlight. As they studied him, "You make it sound so easy," she remarked, her words gentle, but with an undertone of something more, a quiet warning, perhaps. Kael didn't falter. He allowed the silence to stretch for a moment before replying, his voice sharp as steel. "That's because it is." Celine's gaze lingered on him, a flicker of something between admiration and trepidation passing through her eyes. "Every move you make sharpens the knives pointed at your back," she warned, her tone low. "Duke Alva is not a man who takes defeat with grace. You push him too far, and he'll strike at the first chance." Kael finally turned toward her, his eyes dark pools of calculated precision. "He's already dead," he said, his voice quiet but filled with a quiet finality. "He just doesn't know it yet." For a moment, Celine stared at him, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips, a smile that was both an acknowledgement of his brilliance and a warning. "You're dangerous. You've always known that," he replied, his voice low, a dangerous edge underlying the words. There was a brief silence, a shared moment of understanding, before Celine's gaze shifted, momentarily distracted by the view of the city stretching beneath them. Her voice, when it came again, was softer, more thoughtful. 10,000 soldiers will accompany you, enough to subdue the rebellion if you're clever." Kael's expression didn't change, but there was a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "I don't plan to lose a single one." Selene turned her head, her gaze sharp. "And if Alva strikes while you're gone? If he moves against the Empire in your absence?" Kael's lips twisted into a dark smile. "Then I thank him for saving me the effort." Her eyes locked with his, the intensity between them almost palpable. There was no need for further words. They understood each other perfectly. She, the Empress, was no stranger to the deadly games of politics and war. She knew that Kael was playing a game on a far larger scale than anyone could yet fathom. The court, the nobility, and the generals all were pawns in his hands. Silence stretched between them again, but this time it felt charged with something deeper, something unspoken. Selene seemed to be weighing her next words carefully, considering the fine balance between admiration and caution. Finally, she spoke again, her voice a whisper, but it carried a weight that made Kael pause. "Do not disappoint me." Kael met her gaze, his eyes unwavering, filled with a cold promise. "I never do." With that, she turned, her silver cloak fluttering behind her like a shadow in the night. Her footsteps echoed softly as she retreated into the shadows of the palace, leaving Kael alone once more with his thoughts and the chilling wind that whispered through the open balcony. Kael lingered for a moment longer, his eyes narrowing as he gazed toward the horizon. The Frost Vale Highlands, a distant but inevitable destination. The Empire was shifting. Unseen hands were pulling the strings, and Kael was at the center of it all. No more waiting, no more games of subtlety. The war was coming, and it would be his to command. The silence of the night was broken by the low rumble of the bells in the distance, signaling the approach of dawn. The Empire, for all its splendor and power, was about to learn the price of defiance. Dawn. The imperial gates groaned open under the weight of war. The sounds of soldiers assembling, the clinking of armor, and the harsh commands of officers filled the cold morning air. A force of 10,000 soldiers stood in perfect formation, their disciplined lines stretching as far as the eye could see. The banners of the Empire flapped in the wind, their rich silks adorned with the imperial crest as symbols of a power that had dominated the land for centuries. Kael stood at the head of this army, his posture impeccable, his expression unreadable. Clad in midnight black armor etched with silver runes that caught the first light of dawn, he was the embodiment of death itself, a figure carved from darkness and forged by necessity. His black warhorse, large and powerful, pawed at the ground beneath him, its eyes glinting with the same ferocity Kael commanded. As the army lined up before him, 3 figures stepped forward, their presence enough to command attention. Each one was a master in their own right, an expert of war, deadly and capable. First was General Variana, a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and grim-eyed, his face weathered by the harsh realities of war. His armor was battered but well-maintained, and his expression was one of quiet confidence. He had seen countless battles and lived through them all. There was no man better suited to command the ground forces of the Empire. Yet, Kael knew that even Varian's loyalty was a fragile thing, something that could be tested when the storm finally broke. Next, there was Lady Syria, a master assassin from the Southern Isles. She moved like a shadow, her form lithe and deadly. Twin daggers, gleaming like fangs, were strapped to her waist. Her dark cloak billowed around her as she walked, her eyes sharp and calculating. She was beauty personified, but also death incarnate. Syria's presence in the army was a reminder that even the most brutal battles had their subtler elements where precision could turn the tide. And finally, Elder Magnusa, an ancient tactician, his frail form wrapped in the deep crimson robes of his order. His staff, carved with intricate runes and symbols of power, was the only thing that suggested the true strength beneath his wizened exterior. Magnus was the mind of the operation, his intellect a weapon that could topple armies without ever needing to draw blood. He was the voice of strategy when the chaos of battle became too overwhelming to navigate by instinct alone. Kael's gaze swept over them, noting the subtle shifts in their posture, Varian's clenched jaw, Syria's impassive expression, and Magnus' thoughtful gaze. Beneath the surface, they were all wondering the same thing. Could Kael truly win this? Could he crush the rebellion and seize control of the Empire? Or was this the beginning of his downfall? Kael's lips curled into a faint smile. Let them wonder. Let them question. The time for answers would come. He raised his gauntleted hand, and the ground seemed to tremble under the weight of his command. His voice cut through the stillness, loud and steady, "We march." And with those two words, the earth itself seemed to come alive. 10,000 boots struck the ground in unison, a thunderous sound that reverberated through the city walls, shaking the foundations of all that Kael had set into motion. The storm was here, and Kael would carry it to the heart of the rebellion. The Empire would bend or break, but he would not be the one to yield. The Frostvale Highlands stood as a testament to the rebellion that had long defied the Emperor, a frozen realm of jagged peaks and ancient stones, crowned in the perpetual mist of winter. The land was as unforgiving as the men who had chosen it as their home, a grim place where the wind screamed through the valleys like the cries of lost souls, carrying with it whispers of long-forgotten betrayals and unresolved vengeance. Here, the Empire's reach had faltered. For years, the rebellion had bled the Empire's strength, hidden in the snow and ice. They believed they were untouchable, safe in their fortress of ice and stone. But Kael had come to remind them of what it meant to defy the Empire. Kael's army moved like a shadow across the frozen plains, as silent, disciplined, and as cold as the landscape itself. 10,000 soldiers, each a weapon honed by years of war, moved as one, their armor gleaming in the moonlight. The black banners of the Empire flew high, rippling like a storm on the horizon, stark against the white of the world. At the head of it all, Kael rode alone, astride his warhorse, cloaked in midnight silk and silver-edged armor. He was a figure of darkness and power, his golden eyes cold and unwavering as they fixed on the fortress of Edda, a distant, ancient behemoth of stone carved into the very heart of the mountains. Frostvale, the last bastion of rebellion. But Kael didn't come to storm it. He came to open it from within. They camped that night in Blackthorn Pass, a narrow gorge winding like the spine of some ancient beast through the highlands. Snow blanketed the ground, thick and silent, while the wind never ceased its relentless howl. Inside the command tent, lanterns flickered weakly, casting long, shifting shadows across the war map spread before them. The air inside was thick with the tension of impending conflict. General Varian, the embodiment of brutal strength, leaned over the map, his fingers brushing the cold parchment. His face was grim, etched with years of battle-worn experience. "The rebels hold the cliffs. Their archers have perfect line of sight. If we charge head-on, we'll be cut down before we even reach the gates." Lady Saria, seated in the shadows, her posture relaxed yet lethal, smirked as she flicked one of her daggers into the map. The blade buried itself into the parchment with a soft thud, pointing directly at the center of the fortress. "Then we don't charge," she said coolly. "We invite them to open the gates." Varian's brow furrowed in disbelief. "You would parley with traitors?" He spat. "No," Saria replied, her voice calm but sharp as ice. "I'd deceive them. We send an envoy. Offer them recognition of their independence in exchange for neutrality. Let them believe they've won. Let them drink, let them celebrate. And when they're too drunk to resist, we strike." Kael's voice was low, a quiet thread of authority that commanded the room's attention. "Explain." Saria's grin widened, though it was as cold as the land outside. "If they think they've succeeded, if they think the Empire has capitulated, they'll lower their guard. Let them believe the war is over. Let them celebrate victory in their own hall. And when they do," Kael continued, his voice like the edge of a blade, "we'll take them by surprise." Varian's expression darkened. "And if they see through the ruse?" "They won't," Kael said firmly. His golden eyes glinted with the assurance of a man who had never lost when he made a move. "Trust me." The general hesitated, but only for a moment. Then he nodded. The plan was set. Dawn came as cold and unforgiving as the land around them, bringing with it a quiet, deceptive peace. Beneath the fluttering banner of truce, an imperial envoy rode alone toward the gates of Frostvale, cloaked in white and gold. The envoy's presence seemed like a fragile thread of diplomacy stretched across a chasm of ice and blood. From the cliffs above, rebel archers crouched in silence, their arrows nocked, their eyes unblinking. One wrong move, one misstep, and the envoy would be turned into a pincushion of death. But the envoy rode steady, every inch of him calm and controlled. He knew his role, and he knew the price of failure. Inside the stone halls of Frostvale, Lord Alric sat on his throne of iron and frost, a man weathered by years of war, his face lined with the burden of countless winters. He looked down at the envoy with thinly veiled contempt, his voice a low growl. "Of House Rathan offers peace?" He chuckled, the sound harsh and mocking. "So the fox learns to kneel before the storm." He turned to his warlords, each as brutish and scarred as the land itself. "The Empire bends. The Highlands stand. Let us drink to the end of war." The warlords roared their approval, their voices filling the hall. Wine flowed freely, flames flickered, and the fortress came alive with songs of victory. The cheers echoed off the cold walls, but in the midst of the celebration, no one saw the traders, the diplomats, the assassins slipping quietly through the gates, moving like shadows on the hunt. No one noticed the soft, almost imperceptible flicker of steel hidden beneath layers of diplomacy. Kael stood on the outskirts of the camp, his gaze fixed on the distant fortress. Torchlight danced in the windows of Frost Vale, casting fleeting shadows over the stone walls. The sounds of drunken revelry drifted on the wind. A false celebration, a false victory. He allowed himself a small, knowing smile. Then came the raven cry, one long, too short. The signal. Inside the fortress, shadows moved like ghosts. Imperial assassins, hidden among the traders and diplomats, struck with surgical precision. They silenced the command posts, slit throats in the dark, and unlocked the gates without a sound. The rebellion's leaders fell one by one, their bodies crumpling silently to the floor. By the time the outer gates creaked open, Kael's army was already in motion, flowing through the gates like a tide of death. Dawn crept over the horizon, casting gold across the snow and the blood that now stained the ground. By the time the first light touched the walls of Frost Vale, the fortress had already fallen. The warlords lay dead or bound, their bodies discarded like refuse in the very hall where they had celebrated victory. Lord Alric, wine still on his lips, was dragged from his throne, his pride broken. Kael rode into the gates of Frost Vale without a single resistance. The wind carried his banner his above him, a symbol of conquest and the Empire's unyielding power. He did not need to fight. He did not need to lay siege. He had come to show them that war was not a matter of strength, but of timing, and his timing was impeccable. The rebels, so certain they had outlasted the Empire, have never even seen the storm coming. No siege, no drawn-out battle, just a whisper of war, and a storm that never gave them time to scream. The blood-red dawn crept over Frost Vale like a slow bleed from a dying god, bathing the highlands in its sickly glow. The world seemed frozen in time, caught between the fading embers of rebellion and the chilling grip of an empire that knew no mercy. The air was thick with the scent of iron, smoke, and something far more bitter, a defeat. Where once stood the defiant heart of the rebellion, now only ruins and the shattered remnants of broken dreams remained. Frost Vale had been a fortress carved into the very mountains, a symbol of defiance against the Empire. It was an ancient bastion, one that had stood for centuries, built upon the pride of its people and the blood of those who dared to rise against tyranny. Yet now, it lay silent, its walls broken, its banners torn and trampled. The great hall where Lord Alric had once ruled with an iron fist was now a butcher's stage, a place where lives were measured not by honor or courage, but by the sharpness of a blade and the subtlety of strategy. The marble floors, polished once to a gleam, were slick with blood, reflecting the crimson light of dawn like some twisted altar to the gods of war. Above, the banners of Frost Vale hung in tatters, their once proud colors faded and shredded by the wind, their meaning now as hollow as the walls around them. At the center of it all stood Kael, unmoving, a statue of calm amidst the chaos, his golden eyes gleaming in the pale light. His presence was a storm trapped in human form, a harbinger of the inevitable. His soldiers, 10,000 strong, stood in disciplined silence, their dark banners fluttering like ominous whispers in the cold morning air. There were no cries of victory, no raucous cheers to accompany the fall of a kingdom. There was only the quiet, unyielding weight of power. Before Kael, the remnants of the rebellion knelt in chains, broken, defeated, and humiliated. They had come to Frost Vale with the hope of striking a blow against the Empire, but now they knelt at the feet of the very force they had sought to oppose. The warlords who had once dreamed of freedom now wore the shackles of their failure, their heads bowed in submission. Their pride had been shattered not by steel, but by the unrelenting precision of Kael's mind. At the front of the kneeling prisoners was Lord Alric, his once formidable presence now reduced to a shadow of its former self. The warlord who had sworn to defy the Empire lay broken before Kael, his pride a distant memory. His face was bruised and bloodied, his fine garments torn, stained with the evidence of his defeat. The fire that had once burned in his eyes was gone, extinguished by the cold hand of inevitability. In its place was only the hollow ember of a man who had gambled everything and lost. Kael stepped forward, the echo of his boots against the marble floor sharp and purposeful. His gaze never wavered from Alric as he spoke, his voice cold and cutting, like a blade of ice through flesh. "You built this fortress to defy the Empire," Kael said, his tone low and dangerous. "Did you truly believe you could stand against me?" Alric lifted his head, his expression grim, but there was no fire in his eyes, only the cold resignation of a man who had been outplayed. Frostvale was to be a sanctuary, he rasped, his voice thick with the weight of his failure. "A place free of imperial tyranny." Kael's golden eyes narrowed, his lips curling slightly into a mirthless smile. "And yet your first acts of freedom were to burn villages, butcher merchants, and leave orphan children in your wake. Tell me, Alric, how is that different from the tyranny you claim to oppose?" Alric's silence was all the answer Kael needed. The warlord have no words, only the bitter taste of his own hypocrisy to choke on. His dream of a sanctuary had been built on the backs of the innocent, and now the consequences had come to collect. Kael turned away from Alric and addressed Lady Saria, who stood silently at his side like a shadow in the cold. Her cloak billowed around her like a dark phantom, and her eyes glinted with the same quiet amusement that always seemed to accompany her at times like this. "Casualties?" Kael asked, his voice devoid of any real emotion. "Minimal," Saria replied with a flick of the wrist, brushing snow from her cloak as if the victory was nothing more than a passing inconvenience. "Your trap was perfect, as always." "And the prisoners?" Kael pressed, his gaze fixed on the kneeling figures before him. "1,000, Saria answered. "Most surrendered before their swords ever left their sheaths. The rest were less inclined to resist." Kael nodded, his gaze sweeping over the defeated rebels. "Good. They will be given a choice," he said, his voice cold as the ice that surrounded them. "Serve the Empire, or die as traitors." A ripple of despair passed through the prisoners, a collective breath held in fear of the fate that awaited them. Alric's eyes flickered with something of defiance, perhaps, but it was fleeting. The rebellion was dead, and even its leaders knew it. The game was over. Kael's boots echoed again as he stepped closer to the fallen warlord. His voice, when it came, was a whisper of steel, a promise of finality. "But you, Alric," Kael said, his eyes narrowing as he regarded the warlord. "You knew the cost. You dragged your people into ruin for a dream that never existed. You raised a flag soaked in lies." Alric raised his head, his eyes still defiant, though the flame that once fueled them had long since died. His hands clenched into fists, but it was a gesture born of frustration and impotent rage, not strength. "Then finish it," Alric said, his voice hoarse, resigned. Kael drew his blade slowly, deliberately. The sound of steel sliding from its sheath was the only noise in the room, a cold promise of death. He did not move quickly. There was no need, no urgency. This was not about a quick end. This was about making a statement. The sword came down first across Alric's knee, shattering the joint with a sickening crack. The warlord screamed, the sound raw and guttural, but Kael was unmoved. Another strike carved across his chest, and Alric's scream turned into a wheeze as blood poured from the wound. Kael did not grant mercy. He granted meaning. Each cut was deliberate, each wound a mark of the cost of rebellion. This was not a man dying, this was an example being made. His final act, his final defiance, was not in his words but in the bitter silence of his death. By the time Alric's head rolled across the blood-slick floor, the hall was quiet. The silence that followed was deafening, a silence filled with the weight of 100 lives lost, of dreams shattered, of power claimed. The message had been made clear: defy Kilrathn, and your legacy dies with you. That night, Frostvale burned. The fortress that had once stood as a symbol of rebellion was now reduced to ash and cinders. The banners of Frostvale, those tattered remnants of a failed dream, were torn from their poles and thrown into the flames, consumed by fire and fury. In their place, The black sigil of the Empire rose dark as night, sharp as a blade, and heavy with the promise of further conquest. Kael stood on the high balcony, watching as the flames devoured the fortress below. The wind whipped through his cloak, but it did nothing to move him. He was a man who had already won. Frostvale was his now, not through the strength of his armies, but through the weight of his will. Lady Saria joined him, her presence as silent and inevitable as the storm that raged around them. The firelight danced in her eyes, casting shadows across her face, but there was no joy in her gaze. There was only the quiet understanding of what it meant to be victorious in Kael's world. "You were ruthless today," she said softly, her voice carrying on the wind. "Efficient but ruthless." Kael's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, his face unreadable. "Mercy is a luxury," he said, his voice low and cold. "And luxuries are reserved for the victor." Saria chuckled, the sound soft and laced with admiration. "You spared their soldiers because they were never the enemy," Kael replied, his eyes narrowing. "They were pawns, manipulated, misguided." "You don't destroy pawns. You convert them." Saria glanced back at the burning fortress, her gaze lingering on the fading banners. "Sometimes I wonder if your enemies even understand they've already lost before the first blade is drawn." Kael's silence was his answer. His mind was already turning toward the next conquest, the next move in a game that never ended. Because for Kael, there was no victory that could truly be saved, only the weight of power, and the knowledge that one day, even that would not be enough. Frostvale had fallen, but the Empire was far from done.